Kayla. I'm 26, and this happened to my friend Brooke and I last summer, who I totally have permission to tell this story from, by the way. Now, it must have been our 9th or 10th hike together, and we were doing a section up in the Sierra Nevada, specifically the part that starts out near the meadows and heads out north towards Sonora Pass. It's a very beautiful stretch of county with the high desert sprouting up in pine forests and not too crowded on the weekdays either, which is why we picked it for our spot. And we were so hyped that we decided to make a 3-day trip out of it. But now, God, I wish we'd stayed at home. We parked at the trailhead lot on a Tuesday morning, and the weather was nice. Our packs weren't too heavy, but we still had plenty of water, and each of us had a can of bear spray on our belts, which gave us that added warmth of security as we set off into the trees. Now, Brooke was super experienced, and she'd done the John Muir Trail a bunch of times, and I was maybe more of a casual person compared to her, but I was still pumped to spend the whole weekend out there with my hiking bestie. And everything was awesome for the first few hours as the trail wound up into the pines, and we were just chatting, taking pictures, the usual stuff. Now then, around midday, after stopping for lunch by this little overlook, Brooke said that she needed to use the bathroom. And as she wandered off the trail maybe 20 to 30 yards to find some privacy, I just sat there, scrolling on my phone even though service was pretty spotty. 10 minutes passed, and I did think that she was taking a little bit too long, but it wasn't until 15 had passed that I started to call out for her. I yelled twice, but got nothing back, and that's when I started to really worry. I packed up and went looking, following the direction that she went, and then as I walked, I suddenly heard this sort of raspy scratching sound coming from my right. And then what I heard, there she was. Brooke was hanging from a low branch by a rope around her neck. Her face was turning purple, her eyes bulging, but the length of the rope meant her toes were scraping the dirt, which in turn was keeping her from fully choking. She was struggling, feet slipping as I screamed and ran over, yanking out my knife from my pack after dropping and opening it. I sawed through the rope as fast as I could, which felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. As the rope snapped in two, Brooke dropped to the ground, gasping and coughing. I was crying and asking what happened, and then she grabbed my arm with this death grip, and with her voice very hoarse and raspy, she said, "He's close." No explanation, just pure terror in her eyes. I helped her up and we ran for the trail. We didn't stop to grab our packs, we just ran with what we had. We didn't stop for water, but anytime we slowed to walk, we kept looking behind us, expecting the man who attacked Brooke to be there. I asked what he looked like, and all she said, while panting, was, "All black. I didn't see his face." And the only other thing that she said before she started running again was how 1 minute she was peeing in peace and quiet, and the next, there was something around her neck. But that description alone scared the ever-loving crap out of me. It took us almost an hour to get back to the trailhead, and we were so relieved when we saw the cars. Our Subaru was right there where we left, but as we ran straight forward with Brooke fumbling for the key, a guy in black clothes and a black mask stepped out from behind it. He didn't say a word, just started running right at us. And so with a double scream, we took off across the lot toward this Forest Service road that leads back to the highway. He was fast. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind us on the gravel. Brooke was still weak from the choking, but adrenaline had us both flying. I thought we were screwed, but by some miracle this minivan came driving down the road towards us carrying this whole family. We ran straight at them, waving and screaming for help. The parents looked freaked out, especially when they saw how terrified we were, but as I turned to point out who was chasing us, there was no one there. And while that was obviously a huge relief at the time, nowadays it creeps me out. He wasn't some psycho. He wasn't crazy. He was cold, calculated, and he knew a losing battle when he saw one. The family let us in their van while we called 911, and the cops came pretty quick considering where we were in the middle of nowhere. We filled a full report at a nearby ranger station describing everything we could, from the hanging to the guy and to the way he somehow cut us off at the car. And they took it seriously and sent some people to search the area but found nothing. Our packs were still up the trail untouched when they retrieved them later, but in terms of evidence, there was nothing, not even the rope, just footprints that really proved nothing. But those rope marks on Brooke's neck, they were real, and the bruises were there for weeks afterwards. We drove home that night still wired from the adrenaline, and I dropped Brooke at home, and she barely spoke to anyone for a few days. She told me later that when she went to pee, she didn't hear anything like the sounds of anyone sneaking up behind her, but the next thing she knew, someone was around her neck and she was being strung up. Brooke thinks that he was watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment, and I think she might be right. Now, we haven't been back to that trail since, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever go hiking anywhere so remote ever again. If you're thinking about hiking anywhere out of the way, especially solo or in small groups, please be extra careful. Tell people exactly your itinerary. Carry some sort of tracker with you, something with SOS, and never, ever let your guard down. So back when I was in middle school, we went on this week-long outdoor education trip. It was basically a bunch of 8th graders from our school in Reading, chaperoned by teachers and a couple of volunteer parents. And then after driving us up to this trailhead off the highway that had a little camp attached to it, we hiked short sections of the PCT for a week with our little day packs on our backs. Now, the PCT stands for the Pacific Crest Trail, and in this case, I'm specifically talking about that stretch up in Northern California, where the trail climbs out of the Trinity Alps area and heads towards the Oregon border. And the trails there are pretty remote and wind deep through these forests that have a ton of switchbacks, and there's really not a lot of hikers there. Now, we were there to learn about leave no trace, that kind of thing, in what was supposed to be a wholesome and educational sort of thing. But for me, it turned into a sort of living nightmare that still gives me chills even all these years later if I think about it just a little too much. Now anyway, it was around this time that I had a classmate named Casey, and Casey was a real a-hole. He was the biggest bully in the whole school, and since his usual victim was too sick to join us on the trip, yes, Casey chose to bully the chronically ill kid. He decided his next victim would be yours truly. He'd been riding me for about 3 days non-stop, and then on the afternoon of day 4, we stopped for a break near a river crossing. We were told we could explore the area a little just as long as we didn't walk too far into the woods. And then as my friend Jonah and I walked off, Casey and his little cronies followed until they were basically blocking us from getting back to the main group. Casey cornered us and started shoving me, and then when I shoved back, he tripped and fell on his ass. Well, that made Casey really mad, and since he was like double my size, mostly in terms of how wide he was, Casey was pretty damn scary when he was mad. And it was clear he was going to beat the living hell out of me, and I guess I probably should have just let it happen to get him expelled or whatever, but at the time, I was more frightened than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, and so instead of being brave, I turned tail and ran. And I ran and ran, and didn't stop running until my feet hurt and I was totally out of breath. And then suddenly, I was alone among dense woods. And that's when the scared feeling really hit. I tried yelling, but only heard my own voice echo back very strangely, and I started walking faster, and then jogging, but then stopped myself because I realized I was only getting myself more lost. I walked slowly, called out for Jonah, for a teacher, for anybody really, and then I almost pooped my pants when I heard a voice suddenly call out to me. There was an older man sitting on a log wearing old, comfy-looking hiking gear and looking like what I'd now describe as a typical thru hiker. I'm talking big beard, beat-up hat, and with a big old backpack leaning up against a tree close by. He gave me this warm smile as I turned to look at him and then waved me over while asking me what the matter was. I told him that I ran away from my school group and that I was lost. And then in that same super friendly voice, he told me to come take a seat on the log opposite him and tell him what happened. Now, I was kind of nervous, but mainly relieved that someone was there, and an adult too, so after sort of unshouldering my pack and taking a seat on the log, I started telling him my story. I told him I got separated from my school group and that I was being bullied pretty badly, and that now I was scared to go back because I thought that I'd be in even more trouble. He listened, nodded along, and then told me to hang in there because school years were actually some of the hardest of a young man's life. He seemed to hit all of my problems on the head when he said my biggest problem was that I had no control over my time or who I spent it with, and he said that he'd point me back in the right direction and have me reunited with my teachers and fellow students in no time. But first, I had to listen to a story of his, one he thought would help me very much. Now, I bet you're all thinking that he told me some Disney-style story that taught me a few life lessons, huh? Well, the man's story sure taught me something, all right, but while the lesson was heartfelt, it wasn't wholesome, not by any stretch. And in so many words, the man started explaining trail angels to me, and how they're folks who help take care of hikers in their spare time, and sometimes full-time too, depending on where you are. The man explained how he'd been a trail angel once, a long time ago, but by the time I met him, he did something different. He started talking about this hiker that he'd been keeping an eye on for a few weeks. This strong, independent solo hiker who, by the looks of things, was out there to really test himself. The man leaned in and his tone changed just a little as he explained how he liked to leave food in the hiker boxes at trail towns and in caches along the trail itself. Hiker boxes are these things where kind folks can drop off food and supplies for through hikers, and they do it out of admiration or respect, I guess. But the man explained that neither thing motivated him to do what he did, and that he was no trail angel, but a trail devil. He said it like it was kind of a dark joke, but I didn't laugh. I just sat there kind of nervously as I kept on listening. He said the food he put in the hiker boxes, stuff like energy bars or trail mix, was bad, and that he put it there to make the hiker's journey harder, not easier. Now, he wouldn't use rat poison or anything crazy like that, nothing that'd announce itself too quickly. But with careful doses of stuff like heavy metals, bacteria he'd cultured from dead animals he found in the woods, or even things he purchased online, his little gifts were anything but helpful. He said sometimes he used crushed up pharmaceuticals that would mess with a person's kidneys or nervous system very slowly. The symptoms just made it seem like their stomach wasn't agreeing with them, and at first, there'd be nothing but tiredness, stomachache, and maybe liquid brown. But then over the course of the days that followed, while far from any road, the hiker would slowly waste away. First, the legs would give out, then the stomach. But even while they're puking their guts up at the side of a trail, who's going to assume they're eating poisoned food? Some hikers catch on, sure, but just as many assume it's nothing but the altitude or bad water. And the ones that pushed on into town would sometimes find themselves standing face to face with the person that poisoned them, as the man said he positioned himself in places hikers usually stopped after long days on the trails. He said he liked to see up close what he'd done to the strong ones, and how he would play the helpful local just to mess with them even more. He would say, "Oh man, sorry to hear you're sick, but let me buy you a coffee to perk you up a little." But he'd have his own creamer or sugar packets with him, stuff he'd lace with whatever poison he was dealing in at the time, giving them a whole new dose of whatever was bothering them while they were still fresh from the trails. I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing here, of course, and what he told me came thick and fast, and so fast I was just frozen with fear on that log. But as he got into more and more detail, I realized the stranger was no friend, but a really bad man. And by the time he started to describe the hiker's slow decline and death like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, my skin was about ready to crawl off my bones. Now I realized that this wasn't just some made-up story. This was him confessing. He was telling me because he thought that I was just some scared kid who no one would ever believe if he repeated something so incredibly disturbing. And the fear took over then, and I stood up so fast that I almost tripped over my own feet, and I think I said something about needing to find my way back, and I couldn't even bring myself to look as I walked away. All I heard was him saying something like, "Trail's that way, about a half a mile back." He didn't try to stop me, but it was like I could feel his gaze burning into the back of me, and it made me feel like prey. I walked, out of fear that he might chase me, but when he shouted something extra, I bolted in such a panic that I can't even remember what he said. I felt branches whipping against my face as I ran, and my pack was bouncing painfully behind me, and I was sobbing and yelling for my teacher the whole time. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but the fear of what the man would do kept me moving. I burst around a corner and literally ran straight into Miss Ramirez, one of the chaperones. She'd been out searching with a couple of other adults, and when I ran into her, she grabbed me in a hug while I told her everything. The man, the poisoned food, and the trail devil stuff. She got me back to the group, and the police came up from the nearest town that evening. I told them the whole thing, describing the guy the best I could, but I never heard anything back. My parents said the cops probably followed up but couldn't find him, but I was just a kid, so I guess they must have shielded me from a lot of the details since they were the ones talking to them. And I still think about it every time I see those little hiker boxes at the trailheads and the idea that someone out there is playing God, and it makes me sick. The stretch between the Trinities and the Oregon border has always felt a little darker to me ever since, and I'm sure as hell not taking my kids around there anytime soon. I've been a listener for a while now, so apologies that it takes longer than it ought to get this written. But way back in the 90s, me and my buddy Sean were a couple of nerdy college boys with a mutual enjoyment of two things: camping and computing. I know, I can already hear you all making jokes about the wild days and wilder nights. But to us, there is no better antidote to everything that came with being glued to a computer screen for 14 hours a day than the great outdoors. We'd head out to the PCT, either with or without the college hiking club, whenever we were able to, with our intention being to cover the entire Washington section before graduation. Now, some of my happiest memories of my college days were spent out there on the trails with Sean. But then, and by some bittersweet irony, so is one of my worst. So, one Saturday in mid-October, Sean and I drove out into the woods to a trailhead that we'd yet to visit, and then headed out on what was supposed to be just a couple of hours of light hiking. Sean was partially deaf but wore a hearing aid to fill in the gaps, and while it normally worked just fine, it occasionally suffered minor problems here and there. And that's why, as we're walking along and Sean's hearing aid sort of started giving him trouble, neither of us thought much of it. Now, at first, it was this sort of slight background hiss, which sometimes happens when something was interfering with the signal. Sean said that it sometimes happened when his hearing aid was exposed to excess moisture or even earwax, and since we were hiking, it made a lot of sense that it had gotten a little sweaty. But even after cleaning and drying it, the hiss was still there, and it actually got louder as we continued along the trail. Sean didn't let it get to him, though. He was used to stuff like that happening, and a light hiss was way more preferable and considerably less painful than a bunch of acoustic feedback that make it feel like a needle was being driven into his ear canal. But I guess he spoke too soon, because not even a minute or two later, his hands shoot up to either side of his head, and he starts trying to claw out his hearing aids. But then, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but it was like he couldn't. Whatever was blasting through his hearing aid was so loud I could hear it buzzing into his ears as I rushed towards them. And then as I pushed my own hands past his frozen claws, they were trembling like he was having a seizure. I yanked the first hearing aid from his ear, and he fell back like the shakes were the only thing holding him up. Only then did Sean seem to get more control over himself, and he was able to yank the other hearing aid out. Now both were still screeching in the dirt as Sean turned them off, panting and shaking as he sat in the dirt, and then as I got close and kneeled by him, I noticed that there was blood coming out of one ear. I panicked, thinking that he might have some kind of serious hearing damage from it. I mean, he was already partially deaf, so the idea that some technical malfunction might have snatched away what little hearing he had, it was awful. But as I put a hand on his shoulder and yelled about getting him to a hospital, he shook his head as he just said he needed a minute. I didn't bother asking if he was okay. I mean, it was obvious he wasn't. But in the end, Sean said that he wanted to go home, take a bunch of aspirin, and then take a long nap and try to sleep off the headache. Now, I drove us back home, made sure that he got to his dorm okay, and then returned in the morning to find that he wanted to go to a hospital to get himself checked out. Now, it turns out that his ears were going to be fine, but that while he suffered a little tinnitus and swelling for a while, it was normally normal considering what he'd just gone through. And he also had to get himself some new hearing aids, which was annoying, but possibly through his parents' medical insurance. Now, it meant that he'd be without a hearing aid for a couple of weeks, which sucked. But Sean was otherwise back to his old self again after a day or two when the headaches and healing were through with. Now, there was just one thing that still bothered him. Something he didn't bring up until maybe a week or so after the incident took place, and that's how, when his hearing aids started screeching in his ears, he didn't just hear static, he heard a voice. Sean said it wasn't screaming. It was just amplified to the point that it made his skull feel like it was about to split open. But it was clear as day, and it was saying something in this sort of Eastern European-sounding language that he couldn't understand. I asked if it was Russian or Polish or what, but he said he couldn't be certain. It was more this vague feeling of an accent being present while he was just locked up in agony. Now, he said he couldn't be sure that he'd heard anything for real, and that even the doctors said that it could have been some kind of auditory hallucination based on the debilitating amount of pain he was in. But no one started to really wonder what the heck had happened out there until Sean's hearing aids came back from the company who made them. Hearing aids were super expensive back then, and I guess they probably still are depending on your bank balance and what tech they feature these days. But back in the 90s, the medical insurance Sean was on said that it'd be way cheaper to get them repaired than buy him a brand new pair, which could affect premiums and future co-pays, etc., etc. Both he and his parents agreed that was fine, and so they sent the hearing aids off to the company, who planned on repairing them and telling him what had caused the malfunction so he could avoid it in the future. Well, Sean went without for about 2 weeks, and then when his parents got them back in the mail and they were working just fine, he was excited to be able to use them again. But then here's the thing. The attached letter explained that the company hadn't needed to perform any repairs because there was nothing wrong with the hearing aids. This was obviously good news in a financial sense because they weren't charged for any repairs, just an inspection. But if there was nothing wrong with Sean's hearing aid, then what the hell caused all that loud and painful interference in the middle of the woods? A few weeks passed after the hearing aids came back, and in that time, me and Sean had talked about the incident in the woods extensively. I guess I was so freaked out to see him all seized up from the pain that it lit a fire in my belly, and so any spare moment I had, I'd head down to the school's library and sit there reading books on hearing aids and how they work. And that's how I found out that while it's extremely rare, things like radio towers and even satellites have been known to result in extremely loud interference in certain models of hearing aid. The same sort of feedback can be caused by things like power lines, a car's electronics, or even things like digital security systems. But where were the power lines or security systems out in the middle of the woods? That was impossible, right? Unless, of course, we were just so happened to be walking above some kind of secret underground facility, which included top-tier security systems and a bunch of broadcast equipment. Now, I know, I can hear everyone also saying this moron watches too much InfoWars. Well, rest assured, it was just a dumb theory I was kicking around at the time, and I didn't take it all that seriously at the time. But given the absence of almost any other rational explanation, what choice did I have? Now, the scientific method revolves around eliminating the explanations you're certain aren't applicable, and after ticking things off the list for weeks, I admittedly left with some pretty weird stuff. But it was right in the middle of me trying to figure it all out when the thing happened. The thing that kind of supplanted the why as being the crux of the whole freaking story. And I don't know if maybe some of you saw this coming. It wouldn't be the first time I've heard it, but to me, and everyone else who knew Sean, it came right out of the blue. I first heard something had happened as I was walking back to the dorms after class one afternoon. I bumped into a mutual friend of ours, and before I could even say hey, he asked what had happened with Sean. Now, he said today, too, like he obviously wasn't referring to the whole hearing aid incident. And then when I said I didn't know, and he told me Sean had been arrested. I guess he figured that I might know why he'd been arrested, but obviously I didn't. And then what followed was some mad rush to try and figure out what the hell happened from people that had seen it. Now, cut to about an hour later, and I'm in the quad talking to this girl who had seen it happen, and right away from how shook up she was, I could tell that it was bad. She said she figured Sean was in a bad mood or something because he totally ignored someone who said hey to him as he walked past. She said it was weird too because he didn't look mad, and instead he had this sort of blank expression on his face, but still he pretty much barged past the kid saying hey to him and made a beeline for the parking lot in his car. The girl said that she'd carried on watching, but, in the way that you do when you think that there's going to be some drama. And then as Sean got to his car, he kind of stood there, almost like he was waiting until someone else came along and walked past his car. She said once the person got close, Sean locked onto him, and his head moved as he tracked the person walking past and away from him. And then out of nowhere, he opened his trunk, grabbed some tire iron, and then walked up behind the other student and started beating the hell out of him. The girl said people rushed to stop Sean from killing the other kid, but as they restrained him, he didn't yell or attack anyone else. He just kept trying to get to this one kid he'd already beat up, presumably to try and hurt him more. She said he only stopped attacking when the cops showed up, and even then, he didn't so much as even look at the cops who were arresting him. They noticed it too, the cops I mean, because they were apparently asking him his name and social security number and then getting mad when Sean wasn't responding. I guess in the end they figured something was wrong with him, really wrong, because they stopped asking him questions and just dragged him into the back of their car. You can imagine how freaked out I was, right? I mean, we didn't even know if the kid Sean attacked was still alive or not, let alone why Sean had just attacked him like that. Thankfully, the kid pulled through. Not without a couple of broken bones and a little bit of surgery to fix something in his shoulder, but he lived. And somehow the consequences of Sean's end ended up being way more drawn out and agonizing. I don't say that lightly either, and what made it all so terrible was the issue of why Sean did what he did. Because when asked, all he could say was, "I don't know." He later told me it felt like someone was at the wheel and that he was just sitting there in the passenger seat. He didn't want to attack the kid who walked past his car, but at the same time, he couldn't stop himself. He tried all right, and said he remembered yelling at people in the quad to help him as he walked by, but he didn't. He didn't yell, and I don't know if he remembers it wrong or what, but not a single witness saw him yelling as he walked towards the parking lot that day. He just walked in complete and total silence. And that's what had me convinced that Sean had suffered some kind of legitimate mental break that day. Like he was so convinced of his own version of events, and it made him even more agitated to know that his own memories weren't correct. His mom and dad helped him get the best attorney they could afford, who advised him to just enter a plea of not guilty on mental health grounds. The guy told the judge all about the hearing aid malfunction, the auditory hallucinations as he called them, and said the violence pointed towards a dissociative episode. Now, the court then ordered him to undergo a psych evaluation to see whether he was fit to stand trial or not, and this involved interviews and reviews of his medical records and reviews of the actual attack itself, and it quickly became a case of medical professionals trying to determine if the incident on the trail had triggered a sort of dissociative state. Now, Sean's lawyer said that it wouldn't make for a fix-all defense, but evidence of genuine dissociative disorder could undermine the prosecution's ability to prove the required guilty intent. And then once we prove Sean wasn't habitually violent, it could dramatically reduce any sentence that he might get otherwise. And then to our relief, prosecutors engaged in plea negotiations almost immediately once all the psych stuff came back good. Sean ultimately pled guilty to what was called a resolved charge, whereby he took responsibility for the harm he caused as long as the court recognized the mitigating circumstances of him suffering a mental break. Now, the judge also heard from Sean himself, who expressed clear, remorseful recollection of the attack, but genuine confusion about the rage that had overtaken him. Instead of sending Sean to a harsh general population prison among violent offenders, he was ordered 12 months in a minimum security facility that specialized in mental health treatment. And here, Sean was given psychiatric care, monitored, and given a managed regimen of medication. And then throughout his time in the facility, Sean participated in what they called a restorative justice program, which I know for a fact was the most painful part of the process. It basically involved sitting in a room and undergoing supervised meetings with a kid that he'd beaten half to death. Sean said he was sorry a lot, but when the guy wanted to know why, saying he didn't know brought up all the fear that he felt that someday soon it might happen again. Every single why me or why then just made it harder and harder, but Sean stuck it out until the guy that he'd hurt said he'd forgiven him and even shook his hand. I guess it helped that Sean also completed acts of restitution, which helped repair the harm in a much more tangible way. It was kind of crazy in a way. After checking out of the prison without any kind of supervision, Sean's mom or dad would give him over to the victim's house where he'd do stuff like yard work and house repairs or even help the guy's mom peeling potatoes for big family meals. If the victim's family said he helped out, then it all went towards his time served and would eventually contribute to his early parole too. Well, in the end, he got that early parole. And while it wasn't exactly a huge affair, we celebrated Sean's return with a close gathering of family and friends. And after that, it just became something we all lived with. I know Sean stayed in touch with the victim's family for a while after restitution was over, but I guess they drifted apart and lost contact over time, as folks are naturally prone to do. Sean never forgot it, though. The thing with his hearing aid, I mean, and while I know he takes his kids camping these days, they don't go anywhere near the PCT. I guess he's still scared it might still happen again someday, and while we're all confident it was just a crazy one-off, Lord knows, I'm scared too. I recently found your channel, and while I love all the stories, people aren't kidding when they say your voice helps them drift off to sleep. And I guess I never really appreciated sleep for what it is until I started finding it difficult to get any. Last summer, so the summer of 2025, I went through what was easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. And as a result, I was a pretty dedicated insomniac for the better part of 8 months. Well, your channel helped me beat that insomnia night by night and a video by video, so now I figure I owe you a story as payment for what you've done for me. It's not going to be easy for me to tell, so if my storytelling abilities seem a little clumsy or over-emotional in parts, I'm sorry, but here goes. For a little context, I'm a woman in her early 30s, and while I grew up in rural Oregon, I've been living in the Bay Area for coming up on 10 years now. Having grown up in the boondocks, I always found city living to be a little stifling. And so every other weekend, plans permitting, I drive out to a park or forest and then just hit the trails for a few miles of some solo hiking. On the day in question, I decided on Lassen National Forest, particularly the section of trails which made up the Lassen section of the Pacific Crest Trail. It makes for some really solid, no-frills kind of hiking and backpacking, and after starting off, I climbed up to the Hat Creek Rim. Now, there are some incredible views of Lassen Park to the south and Mount Shasta to the north, but after that, the trail drops down in the actual forest, which is where this incident took place and where I was when everything went dark. Now, the last thing I remember, I was just walking along the trail, not thinking much of really anything. And now, that's what's so nice about the woods, I guess. How they make you forget all your problems and focus on nothing but what's in front of you or beside you. And so that was me, enjoying the silence in my own head. One second I was right where I wanted to be, but the next, I was sitting at a picnic table in what looked to be a small town public park. And you know when you first wake up in the morning and it takes you about a brief second to remember where you are or what day it is? It was exactly like that for a second. I wasn't alarmed, I wasn't scared at first. I just took a look around for a moment before it hit me that I was not where I was supposed to be. I started feeling it all at once. The grime on me from not being showered, the fur on my teeth and bad taste on my tongue from where I hadn't brushed them. I felt exhausted, hungry, and severely dehydrated. But above all, I felt fear. I had no idea where I was, and then as I checked my pocket and realized my phone was gone, I thought I was about to have a panic attack. The only thing that grounded me, I think, was the confusion over what I found in my pocket instead. There was a small rock and this sort of pen knife. They weren't mine. Neither of them seemed to have any blood or signs of anything sinister, and I believe that focusing on these anomalies, these strange replacements for my phone, I think it calmed me somehow, just enough so that I didn't completely break down. I had zero clue where I was, but I also had no idea how much of my memory was actually missing or how much time had passed since I blacked out. And so the first thing I did when someone stopped on the sidewalk and asked me if I was okay was ask them what day it was. So I'd left Saturday morning and had been on the trail since mid-afternoon, but the guy I spoke to told me it was Sunday, just after 12, meaning that I'd been blacked out with no memory for almost 24 hours. I didn't have a full-on breakdown right there in front of him, but I did start finding it difficult to breathe. I sat down on the bench with my head in my hands and then nodded when he asked if I needed him to call 911. And about 30 minutes later, a very kind and compassionate police officer was dropping me off at a medical center. They took me in pretty quickly once I told the triage nurse that I'd been unconscious for 20 hours with no memory of it. And then after a very short wait, a young ER doctor came in, listened to my story, and started the questions. Had I any history of seizures, heart problems, or diabetes? Had I suffered any head injuries, or was I on drugs or alcohol? The answer to most of them was no. I hadn't done any drugs since college, but when it came to a head injury, I had no idea. I literally had no clue whatsoever what I'd done over the past 24 hours, and so a head injury wasn't completely out of the question. And so, to get to the bottom of things, the doctors went from just asking questions to performing actual tests. Now, the first thing was a basic neurological exam, which was performed by a nurse and consisted of pretty basic stuff like following her finger with my eyes, pushing against her hand, and walking in a straight line. Then came the blood work, where they checked my CBC, my metabolic panel, my electrolytes, and all that kind of stuff. Now, they did suspect that there might be some kind of heart damage, and the poor blood flow caused my blackout. But thankfully, any kind of heart disease was quickly ruled out. Now, next they did some EKG, where they stuck a dozen little sticky pads in my chest and ran a quick tracing of my heart rhythm. They said everything looked normal on the screen, but they wanted to be certain. A chest x-ray followed to rule out anything obvious in my lungs or heart, but because it was a blackout with amnesia, I was sent over to neurology. Now, first up, there was a CT scan of my head just to make sure that I didn't have a bleed or a big clot. And that involved lying in a cold tube listening to the clicks and whirs while trying not to think about tumors or maybe strokes. But the radiologists over there read it as normal, but later they did a full-on MRI for better detail, which involved nearly an hour of loud banging while I tried to stay perfectly still. And the next morning, a tech came in for an EEG. They glued a bunch of wires to my scalp, asked me to breathe fast, and then flashed lights in my eyes to try and provoke any seizure activity. I felt ridiculous, but laying there, hoping something or anything would show up so we'd have some answers. Now, when the doctor came back with the full results, she pulled up a chair. I was terrified that she might have some bad news for me and I was about to receive some kind of life-changing diagnosis, but the exact opposite happened. All my blood work came back fine. My heart rhythm was normal and all the scans of my brain came back clean. There were no masses or strokes or signs of trauma I didn't remember, and nothing at all that I needed to worry about. The EEG showed no epileptiform activity, even the talk screen was negative, so medically speaking, there was nothing at all wrong with me. She said things about how my blackout was most likely a syncopal episode, meaning purely temporary. But like me, she found the prolonged unconsciousness and lack of memory to be very concerning. She said it was most likely caused by dehydration or heat on the trail or even a brief arrhythmia that resolved before they caught it. And according to her, sometimes these things are one-off events and we never find a clear cause. And when I asked about follow-up, she recommended seeing my primary doctor for a Holter monitor, a little portable heart recorder that you are supposed to wear for about a week or two, and maybe a tilt table test if it happened again. Now, she also gave me strict instructions not to drive until cleared, while I should work to stay hydrated and avoid hiking alone for a while, and come back immediately if anything remotely similar occurs. Now, I thanked them profusely and then left the hospital with something I was certain that I wouldn't: a normal bill of health. But that didn't stop the very deep, uneasy feeling that I had after losing all of 20 hours with absolutely zero explanation for it. All I got were these clean scans and sympathetic shrugs, which I guess was ideal, but none of it explained what happened to me. And as I said earlier, I somehow managed to lose my phone, and this meant that it wasn't until I was home with access to a computer and my socials that I was able to tell my friends what had happened. And as you can imagine, I opened up my Instagram on my laptop to see if I had like 24 notifications from my 3 closest friends, all asking me to call them within 24 hours or they were reporting me missing to the police. Obviously, the first thing I did was let all of them know that I was okay so they wouldn't continue to freak out, but after that I ended up writing up a lengthy explanation, one that didn't just explain why I dropped off, but what happened to me at the hospital too. I copied and pasted it to everyone I needed to in a very typical fashion. It was my mom who was the first to call. Now, I'm just going to skip over that whole part because you can imagine how that went, and for those that can't, well, just picture a lot of tears. But I'll pick up the conversation I had with a friend about a week later, one in which she suggested 2 very ridiculous things to me. Now, she wasn't like insensitive or disrespectful about it, and she only brought it up after we'd talked the whole thing out like 2 or 3 times already. But then after talking about how there didn't seem to be any kind of natural explanation for what happened, my friend Rachel suggested that there might be a supernatural explanation. Right away I was laughing and saying she couldn't be serious, and I guess she wasn't like 100% totally serious with the suggestion. But when she described a couple of so-called UFO abductions that she'd heard of and how their symptoms were basically exactly the same as mine, I won't lie, it was a little unsettling. Rachel talked about these incidents where people had blacked out, lost track of time, and then woke up someplace else with their watches stopped or their phones either gone or scrambled. Now, some of them said it felt like they'd had tests performed on them, as in, like, certain parts of their body were very sore. If you know, you know. But for the most part, it was all about that sense of lost time and being unable to explain where it all went. Part of the reason I went over to her place was to show Rachel that penknife and rock that I'd found in the pocket that my phone should have been in. Now, she agreed that the most likely explanation was that while in that sort of fugue state, I'd found them and put them in my pocket after tossing my phone away someplace. But she didn't have another sort of harebrained theory to suggest, and that's how in her mind there was the slim possibility that I'd been possessed. And just like the alien abduction stuff, Rachel read about people getting possessed by spirits who made them do strange things or go places they'd never been, before leaving their bodies and allowing their consciousness to return. And I'm pretty sure she'd picked the idea up from Stephen King or something he wrote, and at the time I just sort of laughed it off and told her to stop being silly. But then, the more I let the idea roll around in my mind, the more I started to wonder if there wasn't some kind of deeper significance to the objects. I might not have picked them up, you know? What if someone slid them into my pocket for me? Maybe even after stealing my phone, I was too brain dead to do anything about it. Like my feet were wet, right? So if I was so zombified I chose to just walk through a stream or puddle, it stood to reason someone just chose to rob me. And there was also the issue of 2 objects being connected, because it also stood to reason that the penknife had been used to carve a pair of initials into the stone, J.R. And I sometimes wondered if this J.R. person was the person that the knife belonged to, and if that was the case, then they might even have my phone too. But there was sure as heck no finding them, not with a total lack of security camera footage and a total lack of memory too. The cops didn't do much for me on that front, and for reasons I just covered too, but even though they gave up on the whole thing, I didn't because I couldn't. The name of the place I ended up at was called Susanville, California, so one day, after a little too much thinking, I drove over there to find the picnic table that I'd woken up at. I don't even really know what I was looking for, or what I was thinking for that matter. I guess I hoped that driving around Susanville might jog my memory somehow and drag something useful out of the darkness. It didn't, but I did notice something about the picnic bench that I'd been sitting on. Something I think I'll continue to wonder about until the day I die, and that's how it had a little brass plaque dedicating it to someone who'd passed on just over 5 years prior. And all it was Eleanora James, 1937 to 2024, and, quote, she loved this spot. But none of the other picnic benches had a dedication. And it could have been nothing but a coincidence, right? That I just so happened to sit down on the only picnic bench that had a plaque on it. But in that moment, while staring down at it with the weight of this whole goddamn mystery bearing down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some sort of deeper meaning behind it all, something doctors couldn't see or didn't want to see. And I still don't entirely believe anything supernatural was going on. I've read about other incidents of people blacking out with a medical explanation that it's something going wrong with their brain, something within as opposed to something without. And that's what I think happened to me. Some kind of medical event, and one that's entirely explainable. But after standing over that picnic bench for a minute or two and feeling my mind become a storm of whirring thoughts, I came to a sudden and definitive decision. I walked back to my car, took that little penknife and carved rock from the center console, and then walked back to leave it on the picnic bench, right next to the little brass plaque where it had been screwed in place. I can't even 100% say for certain why I did it. Like I said, there's no definitive proof to suggest the two were connected, and there's no evidence I did anything but walk from the PCT to Susanville while picking up seemingly 2 random items along the way. But even today, I still get that strange gut feeling that the knife and the rock and the bench all somehow belong together. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, right? I mean, I left the knife on the bench in the public park. A kid could have gotten hold of it and maybe even done some damage, but like I said, and I'm sorry if it sounds irresponsible, but it still feels like what I did was what I was supposed to do. Or at least the way I try to rationalize it so I don't end up losing my freaking mind trying to figure out why almost a whole day of my life was stolen from me. I live in a small town in the United Kingdom, and all I can say is that it has hill in the name. And therefore, every year the town council do this oh-so-ironic sort of thing of hosting a crappy street carnival that we all jokingly call the Nothing Hill Carnival. Get it? Hilarious, right? Almost as funny as Thanksgiving. In fact, I'd actually prefer that. Well, I'm just being salty because of what happened to me there. I used to have a good laugh there, even if it sucked balls, and was a bit of a laugh with my mates, a good excuse to buy some overpriced handmade tats, look at nice parade floats, all 3 of them usually, and get a bit tipsy. Now this year, in 2014, I'd recently started dating a new guy, now my husband, James. And he was my boyfriend at the time, but I know I'm going to slip up in the story and call him my husband, so you get the point. Now I went to the carnival with James, and there were some decent cheese stalls this year actually. James is a cheese fan, and I've been known to partake in the devil's milk from time to time too, so we spent far too long sampling different cheeses. And I kid you not, we spent over 80 quid on cheese that day and nearly 20 quid on bread. There's this one local farm that just makes the most insanely good cheese. Now anyway, this isn't important. What is important is that we were lurking around the cheese counter when the parade started. The first entry in the parade was a local marching band, and holy freaking sugar babes did they suck. They were all these old fellas wearing what looked like 1940s marching band gear, and I guess it was some tradition that they do in conjunction with the local museum. But some of these old boys, playing the bugle and the French horn and things like that, and they looked like they were about to drop dead. They tried their best, bless them, but imagine a group of pensioners marching along under the blistering sun, playing marching band instruments. It sounded about as good as you'd expect. And so good, in fact, that I whipped out my phone and started filming them, because damn, this would have made for a good content back then when you were still allowed to make fun of people in a nice way. And I wish I still had the video, but my entire phone got smashed that day for reasons you'll soon find out, and the video hadn't uploaded to iCloud on my local town's then crappy 3G back then, so yeah, lost media, I guess. Now, I was so caught up in filming these old duffers giving it their all that I didn't even notice something my boyfriend had done. He was looking at the procession following behind the marching band, a group of tumbling, cartwheeling clowns. And by tumbling, I mean struggling, and by cartwheeling, I mean some of them could do it, sure, but half of them look more like lads who'd stumbled out of the pub and were accidentally doing acrobatics. Now, one of them was proper good at it. He was kind of a big fella, so I didn't expect him to be as spry on his feet as he was, but he was doing these sort of front flips and all sorts. It was absolutely fascinating. And that's who I thought my boyfriend was pointing to at first when he kept tugging on my elbow and telling me to look. But no, it was another clown that he wanted to check out. This other guy was thin, a lanky lad with a bald cap and green tufts of hair above his ears. Something about his gait seemed familiar, and he came pushing and shoving through the parade of clowns, storming in our direction like someone over here had actually pissed on his VHS tape of killer clowns from outer space or something. And he shoved a trumpet player out of the way, who let out a sort of goodness me and came barreling right for us. And that's when I realized that we were this bozo's intended target. He stormed right up to us in these huge clown shoes with this crappy face paint dripping down his face with sweat, clumping up on his dark facial hair. He accused me of moving on from him pretty quickly. Oh God, no, surely not. But there it was, my ex-boyfriend, Am. Now his definition of moving on from him pretty quickly was certainly an odd one. We'd broken up nearly 2 years ago. James wasn't even the guy that I dated since then. I told him it was a long time ago, and then he got all sad. He said he'd never gotten over me and that I broke his heart. And then he did something even more unexpected. He quoted that freaking Notting Hill scene, that famous one you might remember. Only remember, he was dressed as a clown, and he also didn't get it right. And from the best of my memory, this is what he said. "I'm just a guy, hanging out with a girl, asking if she'll let me love her." I did probably the worst thing I could do. But he dressed like a half-assed clown, and I hadn't even thought about this guy in years. He was a brief college romance from what I recall, and so I kind of just laughed in his face, to which he responded by reaching in his back pocket and producing a jar of a very cloudy liquid and quickly unscrewing it. Now he said something like, if I was going to laugh in his face, then how would I like this in my face instead? And for a second, my mind went somewhere gross. But when he took the lid off the jar, I could sort of smell it. A caustic, burning smell. Now remember that other clown I mentioned? The larger lad who was actually acrobatic and putting on a good performance? He was right by us now. Now James, bless him, hadn't quite worked out what Am was going to do. He moved to tackle him, and I remember saying don't, like I think he's holding acid. And the other clown, whose name that I'd find out later was Len, had already realized something bad was going down, but when he heard this, he came leaping out of the crowd right towards me, and I felt him slam against me just as Am threw the liquid towards me. I suddenly felt a burning sensation on the shoulder of my t-shirt and immediately ripped it off. Only a splash had hit me, and I'll tell you now, thankfully whatever substance Am had cooked up, which we found out he'd stolen from the chemistry lab at the school that he worked as a janitor, wasn't that potent. But it was potent enough that it caused some genuine damage to my bare flesh and particularly my eyes. It didn't hit my face though, it hit Len's. Len, who it turned out was wearing thick homemade grease paint that he swore by in his career as a clown compared to the, in his words, sticky, sicky crap that they sell at circus supply shops. I don't fully understand the science, but I know the makeup he used involved a combination of water-based lubricant and baking soda, and he swore by it for makeup that wouldn't run in the heat. It also meant that the acid, instead of destroying his face, was almost neutralized by the damn grease paint. He did end up with a few small scars, especially around his hairline where the grease paint met the wig. But Len, who is now a lifelong friend, is some kind of genius, I think. He kept his eyes shut, screamed for something to wipe his face with and some water, and he quickly asked me to soak the t-shirt and use that to wipe his face clean, and it really did manage to negate most of the damage Am would have done. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, James was acting as my hero in another way. Now, I don't want to be one of those wives, but my husband's a bit of a hard nut, especially back then. so he was beating the absolute living crap out of Am, who, let's not forget, was dressed like a rubbish clown. And at one point he had Am down on the ground and was genuinely concerned that he was going to end up getting murder charges for curb stomping this guy. I mean, if someone had tried to acid attack him, I'd probably have done the same thing, but, I yelled at him to stop and dragged him away. And thankfully there were so many bystanders and witnesses, including the local bobbies, that James really didn't risk much. Am was comfortably convinced not to press charges in exchange for a bit of leniency in the charges against him being dropped down to something a little less serious. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about that. The guy tried to permanently scar me for breaking up with him nearly 2 years ago. But hey, you take what you can in the legal system, I guess. Now, he did go to prison, and he's probably out now, but thankfully I have a restraining order against him that my lawyer ensures stays renewed and active. And so to Am, I hope you've become a better person, because to me, you'll always be a steaming pile of crap and an insult to clowns everywhere. So I'm a big horror buff, as you can probably imagine, since I'm a longtime subscriber of your channel. Love your stories, the scarier the better. And when I was a little kid, I used to persuade my babysitter to let me watch my parents' horror collection on VHS, or have her bring tapes over herself. I'd promise her that I wouldn't have nightmares, and I never did. I handled everything perfectly, except for one freaking movie. One movie that terrified the absolute living crap out of me and gave me nightmares for weeks. If any of you have seen it, you're gonna laugh your asses off. Ghoulies 2. I mean, I guess at least it wasn't Ghoulies Go to College, but still, Ghoulies 2 wasn't even freaking serious horror movie, really. It's a comedy horror, and not exactly the most celebrated of entries in the venerated Ghoulies franchise. Now, I won't explain the whole damn movie, but it involves a group of little critters, the Ghoulies, and one of them is a little bald green fish dude with sharp teeth. The movie takes place mostly at a fairground, and there's a scene where a clown is on one of those dunk tank attractions. You know, the kind where you throw balls at a target and knock the person into the water? In Ghoulies 2, the clown gets dunked and the fish ghoulie bites his arm off and then kills him. Now, somehow in my stupid kid mind, this was what the dunk tank at a fairground was supposed to be. Some kind of device where the person getting dunked was at least under threat of being murdered. And I guess I thought that the tank usually had piranhas or sharks or something in it. God knows, really. Now, I was about 6 when this happened. I was horrified and completely mortified to discover that my dad, who was the town sheriff deputy, was going to be up on the duck tank at the local fair. Now, I couldn't tell why I was so horrified. I asked him why he'd risk his life like that, but he didn't seem to understand what I was saying, and I was too scared of getting busted for watching Ghoulies 2, so I guess I couldn't really explain myself very well. I wasn't the most logical or eloquent kid. Now, the night of the fair comes, and I'm absolutely crapping my pants at the idea of my dad being dropped into the tank of piranhas or sharks or ghoulies. And I kept crying that night until Mom threatened to ban me from the fair, and I knew that I had to attend just in case that there was something I could do to save my father. Now, watching with horror as they filled the tank and he climbed up onto the seat. The tank was about 8 feet high, so neither I nor anyone else could really see the monsters that I was certain lurked within. Now, I got this genius idea that every time someone would take a throw, I'd cough or sneeze or make some kind of noise to disrupt their aim. Now, this actually seemed to work, or maybe some people in my town were just terrible shots, or they were just too afraid to dunk the sheriff's deputy. And the whole thing was just ridiculous. Dad was dressed up like a sheriff clown. He had this Stetson hat on and this huge ruff around his neck that meant that he couldn't really do anything but look forward. And the whole point of being the dunk tank clown is you're supposed to goad the missile throwers into hitting you. Every time Dad chided them on, I remember saying no and doing my best to disrupt their aim. In the end, a local guy realized what I was doing and joked with my dad that his kid was trying to save him from his fate. Now, somehow I got it into my head that this meant that everyone, including my father, knew that it'd be the death of him if he fell into that water. Why would he even agree to it? I was baffled. I had no idea what to do, so I crept around the back of the tank looking for a solution. Now, sneaking through the bushes, I saw 3 teenagers. I knew that they were trouble. They had a reputation as bullies, and even my older sister, who was their age, didn't always keep the best of company, had also told me that these guys were bad news. I watched them from the bushes for a bit, and I realized that they were piercing the tank with what looked like knives and allowing it to drain into the large drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the trees lining the carnival. One of them said something like, "This'll put a stop to that monster." And in my head, I was thinking, finally, someone else who knows. And these guys know about the ghoulie, and they're going to help my dad out. And then one of the teens turned and saw me. He started to look angry, but immediately I assured him that I wouldn't tell and that they were doing a good thing. I think I even thanked them, and this made them laugh a lot and continue hacking away at the back of the tank, letting the water flow out even faster. Now remember, the tank was around 8 feet high, so nobody playing the carnival game could see the water level lowering, and I didn't realize this at the time, but the rough Dad was wearing as a part of his clown costume prevented him from looking properly downward, and thus also noticing the dropping water level. Now the teens told me to keep quiet, and I said, "Don't worry, you've saved my father." And they looked at each other very confused like. I didn't understand at the time, but I ran back around the front to witness what? I'm not really sure. A few more players later, and someone finally hit the target, and the seat collapsed under my father, and I guess I expected him to land in the bottom of the pool like some kind of ninja, safe in the knowledge that the ghoulie or shark or whatever had been swept out into the ditch. And instead, Dad disappears from sight into the pool, and the next thing I hear is the loudest, most horrific cracking sound, and then a scream that should have woken the dead. People were running up the poolside ladder, trying to climb in and see what had happened. I was jumping, trying to get enough traction in my tiny frame to apparently clear an 8-foot wall, and all I could think was that the ghoulie had gotten him after all, and that we'd been unsuccessful in our attempts at saving him. Of course, what had really happened is that Dad had fallen around 10 feet into a pool that was no longer having water in it. Being completely unaware it no longer had water at the bottom, he wasn't even able to brace himself for the fall. He just landed straight onto his legs, shattering one ankle and breaking the fibula of his other leg. Now eventually, after much chaos and screaming and crying and frantic action and paramedics, I realized that I had screwed up big time. Now my dad wasn't a strict dad, the opposite in fact, and that's maybe why I felt even worse that I just stood by and let these teenage delinquents basically try to murder my dad. In my defense, and theirs, I really don't think they intended to cause him as much harm as they did. I think they were just as dumb as I was for believing in ghoulies and thought that he'd fall into the pool and just hurt his butt or something. Now, he spent some time in the hospital, during which I know that there was an investigation into who drained the water and sliced the tank. Now, I was petrified and kept quiet. It's not like I'd done it myself after all, but I did keep dropping hints to my sister and my mom saying, "Hey, remember those kids you told me about, sis? Do you think they could have been involved?" Eventually, people kept telling me to just shush because I was probably only 5 or 6 at the time. Now, I finally admitted the truth to my dad on my wedding night, slightly drunk at the reception, and the fall had caused him to take early retirement from the police force, and he'd gone into local politics instead. Now, at the time of my wedding, he was sitting pretty as the mayor, and he'd done well for himself, and I confessed everything toward the end of the night. I looked from my dad to my sister to my new wife. Sadly, Mom had passed away some years before and never got to celebrate the big day with us, sadly. And Dad began to absolutely roar with laughter, and so did my sister. As it turns out, they'd caught the kids who'd done the crime after a couple of weeks. They'd admitted to everything and been surprisingly remorseful, and also mentioned how a little kid had been there, talking about goblins or ghouls or something. My mom, dad, and sister had put 2 and 2 together and allowed me to live with my secret because in their eyes, all I was really guilty of was not wanting my dad to be grabbed by the ghoulies. So this happened back in the 80s, before health and safety was really quite as severe as it is now. We were just a group of thrill-seeking kids heading to the county fair and excited to ride the most dangerous, unstable, poorly built rides we could find. The more rickety and unsafe it felt, the more we loved it. Weren't a lot of us like that as kids? That was the thrill of the fair, really, wasn't it? The idea that these gruff, greasy men operating the rides genuinely didn't give enough of a crap about you to care whether you lived or died, and that there was every chance that the tilt-a-whirl or bumper cars could go flying up the tracks in some fiery wreck, killing you instantly. I guess that was just part of the fun. Or maybe we were just idiots. We were at a theme park one day, and it had a reputation for being a bit unsafe, and it was in our local area, so of course we hung out there a lot. It was a coastal fun fair and brought in so much money to the town that I'm convinced that brown envelopes changed hands to get safety checks signed off because, let me tell you, there were so many minor injuries and breakdowns in that place. Nothing like the incident that happened to our buddy that day, though. We were strolling down the boardwalk, just taking a break between rides. It was 5 of us, 4 guys and 1 girl, and we were all sort of alternative types. The girl, Layla, had huge permed hair sprayed green. I had a spiky mohawk. You get the picture. People kept away from us even though we were just really posers, honestly, and wouldn't have hurt a fly. Our one buddy, though, the real thrill seeker, had decided that the real punk move was dressed like a 50s dad with a beige tank top, braces, chinos, and thick-rimmed glasses. It was honestly hilarious. These 4 stereotypical alternatives and this one guy who looked like if he were any more square, he'd be a Tetris piece. The square one, obviously, but it was hilariously ironic. He was the wildest one of us, and while I wouldn't say that he was the leader, he definitely was the linchpin that kept us all together. His idol was Andy Kaufman, and if that gives you any idea as to what kind of guy he was, in fact, hey, let's just call him Tony, as in Tony Clifton, the beloved Andy Kaufman character. Our buddy was always doing that impression, and he'd get a kick out of this. And so we were just wandering around and chilling when Tony stopped us all, acting all covert-like, and ushered us to duck into this little alleyway. I went to ask him what was up, but he put his finger to his lips theatrically and pointed towards this little shed where he could hear 2 carnival workers talking. They were talking about one of the roller coasters, a fairly mid one, not even one that we'd usually bother with. One of them was telling the other one that the safety bars in the second was being a bit screwy, and so to make sure that they told the other guy running the coaster to really slam it into place, or better yet, not use that specific carriage at all. Now Tony looked at the rest of us and just whispered, "We're doing this," and then took off into a sprint, running toward the coaster. We jogged behind him, completely aware of what he had planned without him even having to explain it to us. He was going to ride the coaster without the safety bar down, and figured that if he could get there before the employee could warn the current guy on shift, he'd be able to make sure that the bar didn't lock. It had been one of his weird life dreams to ride a roller coaster bareback, as he put it. We got to the coaster, which didn't even have a line because it wasn't that popular, and the rest of us were like, "No way, man. We're not stupid. You do it if you want to," and so we did. We watched from the ground as Tony let the employee push the safety bar down, and then he gave us a wink and a thumbs up and sort of cheekily showed us that the bar wasn't locked in place properly. And the ride took off. We could see that Tony was holding the bar steady, and goddamn him, he was managing it, and he was using one hand to make sure that the bar didn't fly open and the other to hold himself in place against the coaster. It was honestly really impressive. We really thought that he was going to do it. The absolute maniac was going to fulfill his dream of riding that coaster bareback. And then came the incline and the big drop. At the top, Tony leaned down towards us, a speck in the distance, and gave us another thumbs up. I guess he misjudged exactly when the roller coaster was going to shoot downward because he wasn't actually holding on when it did so. And so the roller coaster shot forward to begin its descent, building speed over the arch at the top, and Tony went flying out of that cart and through the air. And I swear it felt like slow motion. Our friend's body catapulting out of the roller coaster and through the air, and I swear I saw a smile on that doofus's face, but that could have just been wishful thinking. Screams were erupting around me as people saw the body flying off that roller coaster, but it all sounded underwater to me, and my eyes just followed my friend as he ragdolled through the air. For a moment, I wondered if maybe he'd land in the sea and be fine, but I could see that he was heading toward the forested area just behind the park. I ran faster than I'd ever run before, and by now, Tony's body had disappeared from sight beyond that tree line. Now I was the first to reach the scene, and what met my eyes wasn't so much a human body anymore. It was pieces of a body, like a person had exploded from within. I don't know if this was because he'd hit some trees on the way down or what, but I can only imagine from the amount of damage that it was very quick and he didn't really feel it. I felt it though, deep in my heart and soul, and I've been feeling it ever since. I see that scene in my dreams at least once a month, and yet I somehow know that our goofy, ridiculous friend Tony would absolutely get a kick out of dying by being catapulted off of a roller coaster. Just maybe not 21 years of age. I think he would have liked to live a bit longer than that, honestly. Unsurprisingly, this death was a bit of a step too far for that theme park, and it was forced to close down. It eventually reopened a few years later under new ownership. Tony's family tried suing the park, but it turns out that the workers who had been talking about the damaged ride had overheard Tony's declarations about riding it. And eventually, under oath, a couple of the group had to admit that Tony knew the ride was faulty, but that he'd intentionally ridden it unsafely. Now, I really don't think that Tony would have wanted that park to get in trouble for his own actions. His family did still get a payout, and the owners dealt with some hefty fines, but I think the alternative would have left them liable for manslaughter, and I know Tony wouldn't have wanted that. He died doing what he loved, riding a roller coaster in the most dangerous way possible, and while I miss him every day, I can't help but hope that he's up there somewhere, laughing his ass off with Andy Kaufman at his own stupidity. I grew up outside of Phoenix, Arizona. We lived rough, played rough, and we were poorer than dirt and had the survival instincts to prove it. Shortly after the events of this story, I joined the Marines, and it was the making of me. I'm a different man now, with lovely kids and even lovelier grandkids. My kids will agree it's fine. And back then, though, we were rough little bastards who thought nothing and no one could knock us off our pedestals. But I suppose we hadn't reckoned on any carnies. Now, I always say, if you ever want to meet men who live harder than you, play rougher than you, and show loyalty to a found family more than you ever will, then you have three options. Join the military, ride with a biker gang, or become a carny. Traveling carnival folk are like nothing else. They will literally kill for each other, and while their code of morals might differ from yours or mine, I respect and understand that. I most certainly did not when the Stanfolk family carnival pitched up in the Poddington's field just outside of our crap-hole little town. We saw the carnival as an excuse to go cause a bit of trouble, maybe pick a pocket or steal a purse or two, show what double-hard bastards we were on some of the rides to impress the chicks. And most importantly, we were absolutely determined to disprove the myth that carnival games were impossible to win. They were rigged, sure, but we were better. We'd clear them out, or so help them God, we'd make sure that they never conned another small town again. Now, this was all before we even went to the carnival, mind you, so we definitely didn't just roll up there that night in my buddy's pickup with the best of attitudes. It was me, two of my male buddies, and then my girlfriend and her friend, who my buddy Pete, the one who owned the truck, was trying to hook up with. Now, don't think that she was too interested, but that didn't stop him from trying. We tried a couple of rides, but mostly we were determined to look good to the girls and win some carny game prizes, so we got hopped up on churros and soda and headed to the games area. Now, the way it worked there was that there was a prize booth where you could exchange tickets for prizes. Each carnival game let you win tickets, and there were big signs saying win 20 tickets here and get 50 tickets there, so it looked like things were doable. Me and my girlfriend wandered over to the prizes tent first, and she set her eyes on this big, fat, plush octopus. She was absolutely in love with the damn thing. This big, green, chubby dude. Big as a St. Bernard. I can remember it perfectly. And it was only 100 tickets. Holy crap, I thought. That was like 2 or 3 major wins on the carnival games. Now first, I headed to the shooting range, where you had to shoot some moving metal ducks with these BB guns. And each downed duck was worth 1 ticket, and if you got 10, then you got a 10-ticket bonus. Firstly, I'm a good shot. I grew up dirt poor and with nothing to do, so shooting cans with an air rifle was an actual genuine pastime of mine. I spent $3 to get 30 shots, which was a decent amount of money back in the 70s, and I managed to down 10 total ducks. I was pretty furious because I had missed the first 4 or 5 shots due to the gun being incorrectly calibrated, a well-known carnival game trick. Now, I knew this, and it still took me a while to adjust, and eventually, over the next 25 shots, I downed 10 ducks. The game attendant handed me 10 tickets with a wide-eyed look, like I'd somehow broken their all-time record. And then I say, "Hey buddy, I got 10 ducks though, aren't that 20 tickets?" And that's when he pointed out that tiny small print which stated that it had to be 10 ducks in a row and also within an individual clip. So you have to spend $1 and hit every target using the bullets from that dollar. Clearly some absolute BS designed to prevent you from basically ever getting the bonus tickets. Now next was the ring toss, and this was just straight up outright impossible. The rings were too small to fit over the boxes, another famous carny trick, and of course when you accuse them of that, they drop the ring over the box and show that no, it does fit. Yeah, it fits when you're dropping it from above, you person, but it's pretty much impossible to land a single target. The guy even gave me a free ticket for, in his words, sucking worse than anyone else he's ever seen play the game. I knew that he was trying to bait me into spending more or getting violent, but I wasn't having it. Instead, I gathered the boys together and sent them off to try winning these tickets. I could see my girl looking at me like, why am I with this loser? Or at least I felt that way at the time, and I was damn well going to get those 100 tickets I needed. I had 11, it would be doable. And here's how it went down. My buddy, who was a star baseball pitcher, managed to get a measly 4 tickets from tossing baseballs at cans. The hook-a-duck was even worse, and we got 1 ticket from that. Throwing darts at playing cards, we did well at that, only to be told afterward that the rules stated that you have to hit them in numerical order for them to count. Sure, it was written there, but put it this way, my vision was strong enough that I passed the military entrance exam flawlessly, and there was no way that I could have read that sign. We tried the basketball game for a while, but it was obvious that the hoops were too small for the balls. Why we decided that we could beat the carnies at their own game, I have no idea. And at this point, we had 20 tickets, a fifth of what I needed for that octopus. Now, it was enough for a prize. We could have gotten a little toy Spider-Man or some doll or used the tickets for free rides. But no, I was determined to get my girl that freaking octopus, and I was about to run out of money. I made one last attempt. I persuaded my friend to take my girl elsewhere, and then went crawling to the prize tent and begged them to let me just buy the octopus from them. I had $20 left in my name for my paycheck, and that was meant to last for almost a month, and I offered them the entire $20. He told me that he'd been my age once, and he knew the value of impressing a chick, but his dad, who ran the carnival, would kick his ass if he sold it to me for $100, let alone $20. He was trying to be nice, I know he was, but I was an arrogant little crap, so what I did was turn, point at the Ferris wheel and yell, "Holy crap, that ride's on fire!" And the prize tent guy instinctively turned, just for a second, and I shoved him over, leaped the counter, grabbed the octopus, and then off I was running. I screamed at my friends to follow me, that we had to get back to the truck. They saw me hooning it down the fairway, waving this giant octopus plushie over my head, and they knew crap was about to go down. And suddenly, I stopped in my tracks. This huge guy holding a chain stood in front of me, and I could see this corporate-looking name tag stuck to his leather jacket that read Stan Stanfolk, and I guessed he was the owner. He accused me of trying to take off with his octopus, and I said I wouldn't have this if this carnival games weren't rigged and if they had any honor. And this is how I know carnies do have honor. They just see those of us who play their game as entering into a tacit agreement to be screwed, I guess. I've since talked to other carnies about this, including a couple I met in the service, and I feel like I understand where these guys were coming from a lot more now. I didn't at the time, though. Stan Stanfolk was so incensed at me calling a spade that he told me he and his family were going to chain us up behind their bikes and drag us through our podunk little town until we were begging for our lives. And then chaos broke out behind me. My buddies had taken it upon themselves to start smashing up the rig booths until whatever they could get their hands on, garbage cans, benches, baseball bats from one of the games, all sorts of stuff. Stanfolk and the carnies had no idea who to go after first. As he was momentarily distracted, I shoulder charged him and snatched the chain from him, and then I ran to the offending shooting gallery and slammed the chain down into the counter. All in all, I don't think we did that much damage, but we did enough so that in our minds, we'd caused the carnies who'd been ripping off honest folk a decent hit to their income. And like I say, I see things differently now, and I think it was our own damn fault for willingly playing games that we knew we couldn't win and deciding that we deserved to win anyway. Maybe others will disagree and think that the carnies got what they deserve. All I'm going to add to this is, after I joined the military and had a wage, Stan Folks Traveling Carnival received a small, mysterious donation every month from an unknown source. Now back to the story though, me and the buds floored it. I grabbed my girl and practically carried her to the truck, leaping into the back with her and her friend. Pete got into the driver's seat and our other buddy in the passengers, and we kicked dust and flew out of there. We were not home free though. At least 3 or 4 carnies on motorcycles began chasing us and shouting things we couldn't hear, but they were certainly threats, I would think. And the chase felt like it went on for hours, but it couldn't have been that long. And this is where I made my fatal mistake though. Being a cocky a-hole, I semi-stood up in the back of the bed of the truck and waved the plush octopus at them as if to taunt them. And I freaking lost my hold of the thing, and it flew out of my hands and off into the desert. All that effort, and I'd lost the goddamn octopus anyways. Eventually, the carnies clearly gave up, knowing they'd come off worse than us if the law got involved. And unsurprisingly, they did report our act of vandalism, and the next day the traveling fair had mysteriously left town. Me and my buddies tried to backtrack over the route that we'd traveled during the chase, but there was no sign of that freaking octopus. The girl that I'd been trying to impress broke up with me that next day. Needless to say, she was not impressed by someone who flew off the handle and smashed up a carnival just to steal her a toy. And last I heard, she'd married someone in software, I guess. Now, like I said, I'm a very different guy now. I'm ashamed of that night, and I'm sure there's a carny out there, probably the owner's son that I shoved and stole the octopus from, who tells this same event as his own scary story of the night a group of Arizona rednecks smashed up their carnival. And I can't say I'd blame him. All I know is the military set me right, and I avoided any real legal trouble in my idiot youth, and for both of those things, I'm deeply grateful. And for any carnival folk out there or any fellow Marines, Semper Fi, fam. So this happened to my grandma, but she's given me permission to share it with you because I think it's a creepy story people should know. She narrated it to me, so I'm writing her words down, but I wanted to preface this so it makes sense why an 83-year-old woman is sending you a story. I mean, maybe you have a lot of 83-year-old female listeners, but I don't see them in the comments that often, so I assume not. Now anyways, I was a fine young filly in the 1960s. At least that's what the men folk said. So beautiful that I could win prizes, they said. And so I says to them, well, why can't I? Don't we have a state beauty pageant? My folks were against it at first, but as soon as I turned 18, they let me enter. And surprise upon surprise, these men hadn't just been flattering me to get under my petticoats, for which I might add, they would have had my hand in marriage first. I really did have the looks that could win prizes, apparently. I made it to the state finals, and it was an absolute honor, and it was part of the state's grand fair, and this was back in 1967. There were 3 judges, the state governor, the mayor of town in which the finals were being held, and a local businessman who did something with oil. All of these men were perfect gentlemen. I have nothing but nice things to say about how all 3 of these men treated us girls. They made us feel like beauty was something to be proud of, not something tawdry, and honestly, the whole thing was a lot more wholesome and respectful than you hear about in the average beauty pageant. I don't think that I could have seen it through to the state finals if I'd been nothing but a sex object. Now this event is what killed it all for me though, and it was thanks to the most unlikely of sources. There were 5 of us girls, and we were all local winners, so we were all used to the game and all very nice to one another. We were prepping for our first round, which was a catwalk round wearing dresses from a local dressmaker. We were in our drawers when the door burst open and the man stood there. He was a bit on the muscular side, with long hair and, I remember, a very attractive jawline. He said he was the sheriff's deputy. Us girls, we were all 18, got a bit shy of course and started covering up, and the deputy laughed and told us not to worry. It wasn't anything he hadn't seen before. He had a wife and 2 daughters around our age, and that should have rung alarm bells by itself. Anyway, he said a prowler had been seen in the area, trying to peer in through the dressing room window, which was a tiny little thing 8 feet high, and we'd certainly seen nobody peering in there. and so we uncomfortably put our dresses on while the deputy unashamedly and openly watched us. And over the next 3 months, he was there every time, watching us, undressing us with his eyes while we were forced to actually undress in front of him. And then finally, it's the swimsuit round, and of course, to change for this, we have to get fully naked. Surely the deputy wouldn't be there for that. But he was. One of the more outspoken girls told him that she wasn't comfortable with his presence, and he got a little angry. He whipped out his badge and asked her if she really wanted to risk her place in the competition, or even face obstruction of justice by posing as a problem. Now, of course, none of this really rang true, but we were in a rush for the final round of the competition. And after a quick whisper, what we did was this. One of us changed while the other 4 blocked her from view. We repeated that 4 times. The deputy was clearly furious about this, but what could he actually do? He had no legal precedent to command us to show him our naked bodies. And so we performed the final stage of the competition. The girl who'd spoken out against the deputy actually won, and I came third, all of which I was thrilled about. And when we went back to change a final time, the deputy was thankfully gone, and we changed back into our regular clothes to mingle with the judges and audience. Now, a couple of us girls met the sheriff and mentioned the deputy being present the whole time, and he got very quiet. We pushed him on what was wrong, and he asked us if we were absolutely sure. Only, it was the deputy's first day, and he hadn't checked in for work. He was due to work security at the pageant, but he had certainly not been authorized to be present in our dressing room, and there had been no reports of a prowler. He asked us to describe the deputy, and we did, and the sheriff went pale and said that didn't sound anything like the new deputy, who was his nephew, a pretty large red-headed guy. Later, they found the deputy. He stumbled in from the wilderness, his ankles and wrists tied together, wearing only a vest and his undergarments. He'd been knocked unconscious, stripped, and had his uniform and firearm stolen. And the firearm was later found discarded in a garbage bin near the hall where the pageant was held. Now, one final twist to this story, and this is a part that I can't be sure about. By 1978, I had a family and a husband, and at this point, a young son. My husband and I were watching an episode of a favorite show of ours when I suddenly pointed at the screen and yelled, "That's him!" My husband asked who, and I said that I was sure as shells were shells that one of the contestants on this game show was the fake deputy from the beauty pageant terror. My husband laughed about this, and so did I. Realistically, what chance was there that a guy who knocked out a sheriff's deputy and then faked being him just to creep on women in the 60s was a contestant on the dating game on the 13th of September 1978? And like I said, I can't be sure. But all I'll say is that when I identified him, all I believed I was looking at was a contestant on the dating game, a contestant they introduced as Rodney Alcala. Now, the more I think about it as time goes on, I do think the creep who perved on me just looked like him, but there's still a chance, a terrifying chance, that the fake deputy we met was the dating game killer. Ave Imperator, Joel. That means Hail the Emperor in Warhammer 40k speech, and yeah, I know it makes me a massive effing nerd. In my defense, A, my boyfriend told me to write to you, and B, it's relevant to the story. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I'm sure that you said in one of your streams that you're a huge nerd, so I think you'll relate to this. If that actually was one of the other narrators I listened to, then I deeply apologize, and for what it's worth, I think nerds are cool. Now, I'm going to call my boyfriend Hank, which is a bit of an in-joke, and when the story happened, we'd only just started dating. We were in college, and I didn't know him all that well, and all I really knew was that he was on the football team, and I kept encountering him when we'd play various pickup basketball games on the college courts in our downtime. We were both decently good at casual basketball, and our first date was actually shooting hoops one-on-one against each other. And then many dates later, let's just say that strip basketball in the middle of the night is a pretty fun partner experience. Now, this came a bit later, though. An earlier basketball experience that we shared was when we went to the state fair with some friends. Hank and I had been dating for around 6 weeks by this point, and one of our buds was seeing one of his girlfriends, so there was a lot of social crossover out of the blue. And it felt like we'd finally really found a solid, friendly bunch of people, all of whom were into sports and physical activities and shared interests. I had no idea that Hank had another side to him. a side that I knew nothing about, a side drenched in blood and dust and rivalries that could spill over into our perfect life. The state fair was always awesome. We always went in the evening and when there were fewer kids running around. The glowing neon lights of the rides and attractions just felt so magical, even as a college kid. The state I went to college in wasn't where I'd grown up. I'd been raised in a much more urban location, so this kind of fair was both a novelty and an extremely exciting treat. And this was the first year that I'd gotten to experience it with Hank and my new friends, so I thought everything was going to be perfect. It was, at first. We went on a really scary roller coaster, which I loved because I got to squeeze up to Hank. And then we went to the Ferris wheel, which bothered me a little because I thought that it would be an excuse for a little makeout time, but Hank seemed distracted by something or someone in one of the other carts on the Ferris wheel. Now, I asked him what was up and what he was looking at, and he said it didn't matter, just that he could have sworn that he recognized a guy, but there was no way that it could have been him. I didn't press him on it because he seemed so serious, and I was still at that stage where you were kind of courting, I guess, so I wanted to impress him and not just piss him off. And so we met back up with our friends, and next we headed into the Hall of Mirrors. Now, we all found this hilarious, looking at ourselves all distorted and weird and ugly looking, and again, though, Hank was distracted. I asked him again what was wrong, and this time he looked at me very serious and said that he thought we were being followed. I asked who would be following us, and he just shook his head and said, yeah, it can't be. Now, at this point, I tried to press him on it, but he just laughed and said that he was being a dumbass as usual. I couldn't help noticing, though, that he kept looking over his shoulder in the Hall of Mirrors and turning quickly as if to catch someone following us. Now, the place was pretty busy, so it was hard to tell if there was even anyone with reflections all over the place, and in the end, Hank sort of laughed it off, and I did my best to distract him by pointing out some cool stuff that we could do next. And the next thing was a haunted house attraction that you walk through. I love horror, and I was excited for this one, but I pretended to be terrified by every jump scare and silly face-painted ghouls, so I had an excuse to grab hold of Hank and play up my Scream Queen aspirations. The haunted house was busy too, and there were 6 of us trying to stick together in the cramped corridors. Hank was absolutely insistent that someone was following us again, though, and when a creepy masked actor burst out of a closet, he almost punched him in the face on instinct. I was starting to get a little more nervous, honestly. Who could be stalking Hank that could have him so spooked? After the haunted house, we began walking down Carnival Alley, stopping to play some of the games. Hank won me a little plush fox, which I still have to this day, and we're all having fun going off and playing the different games, many of which were surprisingly easy to win. And then Hank saw him. A guy with spiky, iced blonde bleach hair, wearing a Korn t-shirt, these sort of punk jeans, and weighing probably at least 250 pounds. "It's him," Hank said. I knew it. Now his face had gone almost white. What? Who the hell was this nerdy-looking guy, and why was my jacked boyfriend acting like the devil himself was on his tail? Hank said that he had to tell me something important. He grabbed me and gently pulled me into the alley between 2 of the carnival game tents, and he held my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. His expression was grave, to say the least, and I swear to God it looked like he was about to confess a series of murders. And instead, he said something I could have never predicted. I'm a professional Warhammer 40K player," he said. "Like, at a national tournament level." He stared at me like he expected me to spit in his face or slap him or something. And then I was like, "Oh, my younger brother would love to talk to you about that. He plays the other one, the fantasy one. I help him paint them sometimes. So wait, what's the panic here exactly?" Hank looked equal parts relieved and terrified. Later, he'd admitted to me that he was worried that I'd think that he was a loser and a dweeb if I knew how into Warhammer 40K he was. And okay, yeah, he is really into it. Even when he told me that night, I didn't quite understand the extent of his involvement. All those weekends when he'd said that he was off on some hunting trips or had tournaments or training, most of it was Warhammer tournaments. And so he wasn't lying, but the guy was an almost pro-level college football player. I didn't know that he even had the time to play tabletop strategy games. But I found it kind of hot, honestly, and it later made it easier for me to admit to him that I collect American Girl dolls from time to time. We all have weird hobbies, right? But none of this is scary. My boyfriend is a national Warhammer 40k tournament champion isn't the horror twist that I brought to you today. The horror twist was that when he told me that the guy that he'd kept seeing was the guy that he'd beaten in the finals he won over the summer. Finals that took place halfway across the country. An opponent who lived even further away than that. A guy who'd been sending him messages online ever since, acting like a salty little man baby saying that he cheated and his army was OP and he only won because he was attractive. Is that even a thing in Warhammer? And that one day he'd find him in real life and show him what real combat was. Now, I maybe didn't take this quite as seriously as I should have because I'd seen the guy and I knew my boyfriend, and if it came to it, I was pretty sure that my boyfriend could one-punch this fool into oblivion, and so I proposed an idea. Let's make him even more mad, I thought. Hank was hesitant about this because he's a soft baby sweetheart, and I asked him if he was 100% sure that this guy was the Warhammer opponent, and he said yes. Now I led him by the hand out into the carnival alley and saw the guy. He was glowering at our friends standing by the shooting range, and I walked over with Hank and said, loud enough to be heard, "I can't believe you were worried that I'd think that you were a loser for playing Warhammer. Like this chump, for example, looks like he plays. I bet you could take him down in round 1. And then I flashed the Warhammer loser this big grin, and he knew that I knew. It was obvious. His face flushed red, and he pointed at Hank and started screaming about how he'd promised this day would come and reckoning was upon him. I then sarcastically said, "Blood for the god," which I thought was a Warhammer catchphrase, and Hank just gently whispered, "It's blood for the blood god, babe." And I just blushed in embarrassment. And that's when that Warhammer loser, angry, spitting with rage, said that if we liked blood so much, then maybe we should experience some blood of our own. He whirls around, grabbed one of the guns from the shooting gallery, aimed it at Hank, and pulled the trigger. Now, the gun made its usual laser bleep-bloop noise, and I saw the mistake dawn on this Warhammer loser's face as he made it. These were not BB guns or air rifles. They were laser target guns, completely light-based, and he just tried to shoot my boyfriend Hank in full view of an entire group of people, including at least 3 cops with what he believed to be a deadly weapon, but was actually a toy gun. That's still a crime, buddy. Now, we were standing by one of those stalls where you grab a baseball and throw it to knock cans down. Now, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed one of the balls and threw it as hard as I could at that Warhammer loser, and it smashed him square in the face. Now, within seconds, this Warhammer guy was tackled by a local sheriff's deputy who happened to be the brother of one of Hank's best buddies. And so then, to cut a long story short, this is how things turned out. Warhammer loser, real name Elias, had a history of unhinged posting on certain internet forums, obsessing over how his opponent, Hank, had cheated and was going to get even with him. He'd eventually been banned from all but the most fringe communities for toxic behavior. And so basically he traveled across the country after finding out where Hank went to college and took a gamble that he'd find him at the local state fair since it was a popular college kid hangout. From what we could gather, he'd been there on the lookout the entire day. This meant that when he grabbed that toy laser gun, there was clear intent to harm, and had the weapon he'd chosen been an actual weapon, it could easily be legally determined that he would have used it. And this meant that he'd be facing a pretty serious charge simply for pointing a toy laser gun at someone and trying to shoot them. In the end, we did him a solid, especially because I didn't really want his dumbass trying to counter-sue me for breaking his nose. We agreed with the prosecutor that we drop our own charges against him as long as he was forced to undergo mandatory anger management. Hank also used his connections in the Warhammer scene to ensure that this Elias was banned for life from a number of high-profile national tournaments. It was all very silly and almost comical, but if you think about it, the fact that he traveled across the country and was willing to fire at least a BB gun or an air rifle at my boyfriend in revenge for sucking at Warhammer is actually pretty freaking terrifying. And it's a reminder that there are some absolutely unhinged people out there. On the plus side, though, Hank and I bonded even further over his nerdy hobby, and he helped my brother evolve from the fantasy Warhammer to the 40k universe, and now they both help run a local tabletop gaming group. Sometimes I even hang out and I mostly just play Pokemon. Anything else is a bit too violent for me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links for these are down below in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't boil your noodles in milk. Long-time listener, first-time writer. I'm a woman in her early 20s working my way through college and trying to come out the other side with as little debt as possible. I've never had a reason to write into you before, but bro, something majorly effed up happened to me last month, and I'm thinking, dang, I'm gonna send this into Let's Read. And so I do a bit of this, a bit of that, but one of my hustles is working as an Uber Eats driver when I have spare time from my other jobs or from going to the gym. I always gotta be on that graft, you know what I'm saying, brosif? No, anyways, this one day I get an order that comes up on the app, a McDonald's delivery, and I accept it because I'm nearby. I don't recognize the address, which is odd because I know this town pretty well, but whatever. I took the order, waited longer than usual for the teenage workers to get their thumbs out of their butts and prepare the food, and then off I headed to my delivery location. It turns out it was right at the edge of the perimeter that we're allowed to deliver within, so basically the food was going to be cold as crap when it got there, and still, not my problem, I thought. They ordered it knowing the expected delivery time, and that's what microwaves are for. Now, I only say this because the further I got from the McDonald's, the more run-down and grody the neighborhoods got. We started in a sort of run-down urban area in the first place, and then drove through a suburb that looked like it had been cursed by the demon of poverty itself. It kind of looked like the way movies portrayed Detroit when they're trying to emphasize how bad it can be, but also maybe even more abandoned. There was barely any graffiti, which was weird. Like, even the criminals and the youth gangs didn't want to hang out in this area, it seemed. And no wonder I'd never heard of the place before. Now, I heard fear being described on a podcast as bone prickles not long ago, and that term struck me as perfect. Driving with this goddamn McDonald's, the smell of fries and Big Macs making me feel kinda sick, I started suffering with the bone prickles. And the moment I heard the guy say that phrase on the podcast, I knew exactly what he meant. It's like when your entire body tingles and prickles thanks to some kind of unspecified fear, and I was feeling this just by driving to the delivery location. Now, eventually I reached this address, and it was on the very edge of some rundown suburbia. Now, if this house had been the only occupied property on the block, I wouldn't have been surprised. The rest of the houses were completely dark, boarded up, and run down. This one house had light spilling out of every window and chill, relaxing music playing loud enough for me to hear as I pulled up to the curb outside. Some kind of pop punk or something kind of fun. Now, I manhandled the bag that keeps the food warm, although with how long it had taken to arrive at that location, I didn't have much faith in their fries being hot anymore. Again, everything had fallen within the promised delivery time, so no issues there. I hauled butt up the driveway, surprised at how heavy their food order was, and I knocked. It took a few knocks before the volume of the music inside lowered, and the door was answered by a pretty-looking guy, a very reassuring gentleman. Now, he must have been in his mid-20s, and he was wearing a band tee and had a goofy expression that made me think that he might have been stoned. Now, I explained that I was there to deliver the food, and he yelled back in the house that some chick was here with a McDonald's. Had anyone ordered any food? I explained that that was a pretty large order, so maybe it was for a bunch of them, and he seemed pretty confused by this. Now, he said that there was only 3 of them in the house, and they'd recently gotten a delivery pizza, so he couldn't really explain who'd ordered the McDonald's. I showed him the app and confirmed 100% that the address was correct, and He asked me to wait on the porch while he went and checked with the rest of the guys, and so I was just stuck standing there while I heard vague noises from within. Muffled voices turned into banging and almost shouting, and I began to feel that bone prickle again. Eventually, this goofy streamer reappeared at the front door. Now remember, I still had the food in the thermal bag at this point, and he apologized profusely, saying he was an idiot and the other guys had ordered McDonald's as well as pizza, and everything was all good. However, just as I started to unzip the bag, he told me to hang on because they wanted to offer me a tip. I told them they could do it through the app and they didn't have to do it at all, but this guy was absolutely adamant that they were going to give me $10 for the trouble, so if I could just wait on the porch again, he'd head inside and get the cash. Now, who even keeps cash around these days, to be honest? Now anyways, this time he left the door open just enough for me to see inside. The front door opened into the living room, and I was kind of impressed how clean and frankly awesome the place looked. They had framed posters on the wall, a couple of pinball tables in the corner, and an expensive-looking flat-screen TV. Now, this didn't seem to be the room that they were hanging out in either, and I sort of nosily peered around to see where my new delivery friend had gone to find my tip. Now, I saw him milling about back and forth past the door to what seemed to be a kitchen, and then calling out down a set of stairs to what looked like a basement. I wondered if they had an even more impressive home theater system down there or something, and I wondered if it was just one of those cases where someone with money buys a house that looks run down from the outside in an abandoned neighborhood area and then just uses the crappy exterior to actually mask a really awesome dwelling. Now still, it was none of my business. Now eventually my new friend came back with $10.69, and I just politely laughed at the obvious joke. Now, I finally fished out the huge bags of McDonald's out of the insulated bag, and I could tell already that by now they were cold, and I figured I just wouldn't make mention of it. This guy had kept me on the porch long enough at this point. Now, after thanks and some goodbyes, I headed back to my car, got in, and then checked for more jobs. There was another one at the same McDonald's, so I figured why not. It had just come through, so by the time I reached the restaurant, the order should be ready. So I started to drive off. I have one of those reversing cameras in my car, and I admit I rely on it a little bit too much, so my rearview mirror isn't perfectly aligned like it should be. Instead, it lets me view the back seat, something I'd adjusted for it recently when I was taking my niece and nephew out for, ironically, McDonald's. And as such, glancing into the rearview mirror allowed me to notice that there was someone lying on the floor in the back seat. Now, I could tell he was a guy in his mid-20s. And I also could tell that he was holding some kind of weird knife, and I don't know how to describe it. It was clearly some type of kitchen implement, but I'd never seen a knife like that before. And I suddenly realized that the delivery customers had kept me at the door for so long without turning back to my own vehicle that it could have allowed one of them to actually slip inside. Now, I didn't expect to be more than a minute or two, so I didn't lock the car behind me, and now I was regretting that immensely. What the hell did this guy have planned for me? He was just laying there, staring off blankly like he was waiting for something, clutching that kitchen blade. Now obviously whatever he had planned was nothing good, and the first thing I did was I decided to do a stop looking in the rearview mirror, and I didn't want him to see that I'd seen him. Now obviously this was all happening within a split second. My heart was absolutely pounding, and I was certain that this was how I would die, with my throat slit as I was heading to an Uber Eats delivery. Now up ahead I saw the lights of a gas station. I kept my speed normal and I didn't allow myself to react at all, and then moments before I reached the turning into the gas station, I shot forward, screeched into the parking lot, leapt out of my car, and then ran into that gas station. Now I must have sounded like some crazy woman, yelling how a delivery customer stoner McDonald's order guy was hiding in my backseat and had a weird knife, and I didn't know what he had planned, and blah blah blah. I was just trying to explain the events and my theory and how I thought the delivery customer had distracted me, and I was almost telling all of this at once. Now the clerk, an older man, looked at me like I was on meth, understandably so, and then started to ask me to explain everything again. However, he kind of froze and his mouth was now hanging open, and I followed his gaze. An absolutely ridiculously tall man was kind of unfolding himself from my back seat, and we watched as he fled into the darkness of the night. Now bear in mind, this was on the edge of the suburbs, so he fled into some kind of forested area. And from the expression on his face, I couldn't even claim to this day that he meant me harm. It almost looked like he was petrified too. Of course, that didn't stop me calling the cops. They got to the gas station really fast and searched the nearby area. They did, in fact, find a knife nearby. Apparently it was some kind of fish knife for sushi, but it had nothing on it. When they paid to visit the delivery customers, they were just as baffled as I was. Everyone was accounted for, which they could prove, and nobody who lived there matched the description that I gave of the guy who'd crept into my back seat. Now, I never did find out who he was or what his motives were. I didn't quit my delivery job or anything silly like that. I just took to actually locking the car door whenever I stepped out to make a delivery, regardless of how brief I thought it would be. And I always checked the back seat no matter what. Something tells me that the guy hiding out in my car didn't mean me harm, but the look of fear and alarm on his face as we watched him flee makes me think that someone out there would have done us more harm than I can even fathom if they'd found it. It's one of those creepy mysteries that I'm grateful didn't turn into an unsolved murder and has finally given me something to write into you about. But like they say, be careful what you wish for, because I feel like this was a cautionary tale where the lesson is that it's far better not to wish you had a scary story to share with internet people. So I'm from England, and I won't say where so as not to dox myself or lose my job, but I'm a postwoman, or a postie as we say here, and I love my job. I work a rural route, and I've been on the same route for years, thanks to some pleading and a friendship with the head postmaster. Normally posties get shifted around all the time, and so I kind of know everyone on my little route, at least everyone who makes themselves known to me anyway. There was Stu, a mature student who would always be waiting at the door whenever the mail came and shared his latest work on marine biology with me. I hadn't started out as being remotely interested in marine biology, but Stu had mentioned a few things in passing and I'd been hooked, pun intended. Now there was old Mrs. Rader, who always seemed to have some insane medical ailment which she'd relay to me with the greatest of glee, and I became convinced that she was a medical miracle. And then there was the Four Bottoms, an extremely flamboyant glam rock band by night and a middle-aged polycule who enjoyed cardigans and gardening by day. And then there was Joe and Joanne, two twins with rich parents who often got Amazon parcels in the mail, and I've never seen two kids who were more spoiled but more grateful for everything they'd got. Now the one guy I never got to know was Farmer McKay, the allegedly grouchy postman-hating farmer who lived in the small holding on the outskirts of town. Now, to call it a farm would be extremely generous, but it did have a few goats, a couple of sheep, a pig, and some chickens, and it was also filthy, even by farm standards, and as far as I know, he made an entire living selling eggs and milk to locals. Now, I gotta admit, I prefer Sainsbury's. Now, one day, for the first time in about 6 years of doing this route, I was shocked to find that I had a collection for McKay's farm. Not everyone knows this, but you can book Royal Mail to collect parcels, often for free, instead of having to take them to a post office. McKay had booked a free collection with instructions absolutely not to knock and disturb him, but instead find the package in an outhouse which he kindly uploaded a picture of so there was no mistaking it. Now, I made sure that I wore my wellies that day as I didn't fancy wading across the sludge that McKay called a yard. It turns out I made the right call because the mud leading to the safe place outhouse was almost up to my ankles. When I opened the outhouse, I was met with a smell that almost made me gag. I didn't even want to look at what else he kept in there, but thankfully the Royal Mailbox was visible right at the front, so I grabbed it and headed back to my van. Now, halfway back to my vehicle, I noticed that the parcel was leaking. Real disgusting, foul-smelling liquid dripping out of the bottom of the box. Well, there's absolutely no way that I can take this as a collection for a million reasons. And now, I also couldn't just abandon it, which meant that I had to break his cardinal rule and go knock on his door and tell him that, unfortunately, I couldn't accept his collection. Halfway between my van and the front door of the farm, the package I'm carrying sort of collapses inward. The bottom falls out and the contents spill all over my bottom half. Now, let me tell you, I've smelled some bad smells in my time. Before I became a postwoman, I was a nursing assistant in my late teens and early 20s, and there was this one old lady that I treated who I would swear had death himself living in her nether regions. This made that smell like flowers and cinnamon. It was a pile of rotting, liquefying organs, and now it was covering as much of my legs and torso as it managed to besmirch. I dropped the destroyed parcel and threw up there and then, which really didn't help matters. And now I was kind of mad at Farmer McKay. There are extremely strict rules about what you can and can't mail in the UK, and rotting, liquefied offal is definitely a forbidden item. I didn't even need to check the handbook to know about that. But then I started looking at all that stuff. Maybe my imagination was running away from me, but I was sure that I could make out part of a human spine among the gore. An eyeball winked out at me, clearly fresher than some of the other unspecified parts that covered me, the ground, and everywhere. Now I suddenly got this idea that McKay was trying to use the Postal Service to hide evidence of a crime, and standing out there in the open in the center of this small holding in the middle of nowhere, I suddenly felt very vulnerable and exposed. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I was convinced my colleagues would give me absolute crap if I fled the scene, but I started picturing Farmer McKay hiding behind a curtain, looking out one of the windows, a cocked shotgun aimed right at me. And so I kind of ran toward the main house. As the front door began to open before I even reached the porch, I wondered if I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. But the man who stood on the doorstep wasn't Farmer McKay. I could see the resemblance, but he was a much younger man, and as he took in the sight of me covered in those organs and trembling in fear, I could see genuine guilt and regret on his face. He didn't invite me inside. You can hardly blame him. I was dripping in unspecified corpse juices. But there on the doorstep he explained that Farmer McKay had been taken away by doctors the day before after increasingly strange and erratic behavior that had gone unnoticed by his family. He apologized profusely for the parcel collection being overlooked because they should have known that something was awry. McKay never sent packages. I was severely shaken, not least because I couldn't face the idea of getting in my beloved post van covered in this. And thankfully, the grandson, as that's who he turned out to be, helped me hose off the worst of it before I headed back to my van. It's what I saw in the back that really caused this to be a scary story, though. I made the mistake of glancing into the dilapidated barn as I trekked across the mud to my post van, and I only caught a quick glimpse because I looked away as quickly as possible. But no matter how many hot showers I took to wash off all those juices and the gore from my body, I can never scrub the sight that I saw from my mind. In the barn, Farmer McKay had piled what were presumably all of his animals. I couldn't make out which species they were. They'd all melted into one festering, indiscernible pile of corpses. A number of empty cardboard boxes sat nearby, and I could only assume McKay planned on shipping the remains of his animals to various places. To this day, it drives me mad that I never checked and don't remember who the recipient of the original parcel was. I have no idea what his motive was for mailing these liquefied parts, and I guess that's partly the problem with whatever was wrong with him, dementia or whatever had befallen him. It doesn't make sense. He could have been aiming for revenge on his enemies, and he could have believed that he was shipping genuine prime cuts to customers of his farm. Either way, I'm not sure I ever want to know. The McKay small holding was demolished not long after, and after what I saw, I can't say I'm at all sorry that it became one less stop on my postal route. So I'm not much of a storyteller, so I'll try my best here, but I've always wanted to try my hand at putting this story down on paper. In the early 90s, I was a bicycle courier for a local mom-and-pop pizza joint here in New York City. I got in the job while I was still in high school, thanks to my dad being a regular customer at the store and getting to know one of the owners, the husband, who we'll just call Pop Soul. Pop and Mama Soul ran the pizza joint and had been running it for as long as I can remember. It had been my favorite pizza place ever since I was a little kid, and I'd even had a couple of birthday parties there, even though I was only really designed for a handful of dine-in customers. And then beyond that, it became a staple that every birthday, same for my sister, we'd get copious amounts of Soul pizza pies. That's not to mention the pizzas we'd get just because, good God, once you tried Soul's pizza, nowhere in NYC compared. Now my brother, who'd left home by the time I was 6 or 7, never seemed to eat at that pizza place. And when I asked him one time, he just said that he wasn't a fan of a lot of things about them, quote unquote. So one day, my dad calls me aside and says, "Son, I got you your dream job." Now at the time I wanted to be a military sniper, an F-18 pilot, or a pro street racer or something like that, but I was pretty sure that Dad hadn't hooked me up with something like that. But when he told me that I was going to be a bicycle delivery boy for Soul Pizza, I was almost as psyched, especially because this meant that I got 1 free pizza a week and a 10% discount off orders like all the time. And I got to ride my bike all over the city, something I loved doing anyway, while getting some cash in my pocket to see me through the last year of high school. What could be better, I thought. And things went absolutely smoothly with Soul Pizza for the first month or so. According to Pop Soul, I was, quote, the best goddamn bike boy they'd ever had, and hiring me was the best decision he'd ever made since marrying Mama Soul. And considering he had kids and had no doubts made other major decisions since then, I wasn't sure I believed all this praise, but I wasn't going to argue if Pop wanted to keep me sweet. Now, the free pizza was a kicker too. The first couple of weeks I was too shy to ask for anything but a margarita, but then one day Pop says, "Come on, son. I know you like your pies heavy with toppings. Go nuts. Ask for whatever you want." And so I did. I tried out so many combinations, so many wild pizza mixtures that, by God, I wish I could remember some of them, because I swear if I could start my own pizza chain with pre-made pizzas using toppings that nobody ever thought of before but are absolutely heaven-sent. Now, unfortunately, the events that happened a few months into my time at Soul's Pizza kind of made me forget everything that had gone down, other than the incident. Now, I still remember the fateful order that kicked everything off, though. It was a double pepperoni with extra cheese, side order of garlic bread too, and the delivery address was downtown, somewhere I wasn't familiar with, but I checked the location on a map. Yeah, no MapQuest or GPS or whatever was back then, and I figured that I could get there pretty easily, so I loaded up the pizza, leaped on my bike, and headed toward what I thought was the optimal route to my location. It turns out the location was a series of warehouses, and I should have realized something was wrong then and there, although it wasn't entirely unheard of that we delivered to places of work or other odd locations. I stopped the bike, trying to work out exactly where Warehouse 13 was in this maze of identical metal sheds, when suddenly a van comes screeching out of nowhere and pulls to a stop inches from my bike. Now, I'm just kind of left confused at this point. So much so that I don't react when the 4 masked men come bursting out of the back of the van and just full body snatch me off of my bike, each of them grabbing a limb to stop me from thrashing and then throw me into the back of the van. Now, stupidly, I remember that the first thing I yelled was that, "Hey, there was a pizza on that bike," and it was going to get cold and had to be delivered before the 35-minute delivery promise was up. Now, one of the 3 masked men who'd climbed back into the rear of the van with me seemed to find this crazy hilarious and couldn't stop laughing. And I guess the 4th man had gotten into the front passenger seat because another of the guys' open palms slapped the dividing wall, indicating to the driver that we should head off. Now, I winced as I heard the sound and felt the crunch of my bike being run over as the van drove forward. And the next thing I know, I felt a little prick on the side of my neck. One of the guys had shot me up with something, and it only took a minute or 2 before I was fully out. Now, after being completely blacked out, the next thing I knew, I woke up in what appeared to be a basement. It wasn't some dirty basement, though. It appeared to be at least carpeted and somewhat high quality, which for some reason I found reassuring in the moment. A couple of the men were there too, and at no point did they remove their masks, which I knew from watching way too many action and spy movies might actually be a good sign. Now, they barely spoke to me but told me that I'd be fine as long as I just shut up and stayed put and did anything I was told. I spent the next 3 days in that basement, and I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't hell. Although the constant fear that they could turn on me and kill me at any moment, it was just kind of a buzzkill. Now, I was given one meal a day and a glass of water whenever I asked for one, and I was also escorted to the bathroom in an adjoining room whenever I asked to go. Now, it was the one meal a day that had me curious, though. It was pizza. Every meal was pizza. And not just pizza, but pizza from another rival mom-and-pop pizza restaurant a few blocks over from the joint I worked at. Now, naturally, I assumed that this was some pizza parlor gang turf war, and I couldn't have been more wrong, though. Being fed pizza from the rival joint was just the kidnapper's idea of a joke, I guess. And so after 3 days of being vaguely threatened with death but treated bizarrely well, I was shot up again with whatever knocked me out the last time. And the next thing I know, I'm lying on the sidewalk outside of Soul Pizza. My old place of employment was now boarded up, with crime scene tape covering a number of the boards. Eventually, after pulling myself together and heading into a pharmacy to grab some Tylenol, bizarrely, the kidnappers had dropped me off with $20 in my shirt pocket, despite the fact that I was carrying no cash when they grabbed me, and I made my way to the local police station. And then I told them everything, how I'd been grabbed, how I'd been strangely well treated, and how Soul Pizza was now closed down. Now, the desk sergeant was really weird and strange when he responded. Like, I really had to encourage him to take the details of my story down. And eventually he did so, going through the motions, but then he gave me this sort of knowing look and told me that I should count myself lucky, because the people I worked for, the lovely elderly couple who had been a pizza joint staple since I was a kid, were not good people at all. He then explained that there had been a police raid while I was kidnapped, and wasn't that weird and lucky that I hadn't been caught in the crossfire and ended up safe. And then he asked me to pass his regards to my much older brother, who himself was a cop working vice at another department. Now, it was all incredibly baffling and strange, at least until I spent some time thinking about it. You see, I'm pretty sure that the guys who kidnapped me were the cops, doing a favor for my brother, and I think he wanted to ensure that I wasn't wrapped up in all of that. And so instead of doing what any sensible brother would do by taking me aside and explaining things, he had his cop friends kidnap me and scare me half to death as a way of ensuring that I didn't accidentally get shot and killed. And that's the best case scenario I can come up with anyway. Everything else results in me coming even closer to almost dying, and that's all too hard to comprehend. My brother has sadly passed away now, so I can't ask him, but I'd like to think that he was my guardian angel that day. Otherwise, it was mere luck and the grace of God that prevented me from losing my entire life over becoming a pizza delivery boy from my favorite childhood restaurant. When I was a little kid, for reasons I won't go into, I lived with my maternal grandparents around 80% of the time. Time spent with Mom and her various boyfriends was not so good, but on the other hand, Grandma doted over me. Grandpa was stoic, a regimental man who showed me nothing but respect, but we weren't close in the same way Grandma and I were. From an early age, I'd learned that being coddled was a bad thing, so I made sure to try my best and live up to Grandpa's belief that I should be a real man, trademark. And then when he wasn't looking, which was most of the time, I'd happily let Grandma baby me and treat me like her special little boy. Cookies, treats, $1 slipped in my pocket here and there, and the kind of freedom and pleasant treatment that I most certainly did not get at home on the rare occasions when Mom was ruled suitable to look after me, and also decided to make the effort to demand that her mother send me back to her. Now, thankfully, by the time I reached around 12 years old, I'm pretty sure Mom had either completely given up caring or forgotten that I existed altogether. The last time I saw her involved a screaming fight and my grandparents silently marching me away from the house. I haven't seen or spoken to my mother since in 10 years, and I'd be lying if I said I regret it. Everything with Grandma and Grandpa was like a dream compared to my upbringing. Like I said, as an ex-army guy, Grandpa could be a bit regimental, but I never actually got to see him act out any of his warnings. I think he just felt like he should make vague rumblings about being a strict father figure. Honestly, the idea of disappointing Grandpa and not growing up into a good, clean, classic man was enough to keep me on the straight and narrow by itself, but maybe that's just who I was, a very regular, normal guy. Now, one of my favorite activities with Grandma was the Christmas card run. There would be no mailing Christmas cards with Grandma, at least not to anyone within a 40-minute driving distance of our home, and Grandma and Grandpa were both extremely popular figures in the community, so they had a pretty extensive Christmas card list. Right up until my early teens, I used to get genuinely excited about doing the Christmas card rounds with Grandma in early December, and it really felt like the season had truly begun. Now, I loved it, right up until the time I stopped loving it anymore because we both almost died, purely for delivering Christmas cards. It was a crisp, cold morning, the kind that you don't mind being cold because it feels like Christmas is in the air. We were headed to the third delivery of the day. This year, we had so many cards to hand deliver that we set aside that Thursday and Friday. The recipients were an elderly couple, older than Grandma and Grandpa, who they went to bingo with and occasionally got together with, along with a few other couples from that social circle. I forget their names now, bizarrely, but we'll just call them the James couple. Now, Mr. James was one of those quiet, balding, bespectacled guys who Grandpa had told me, almost disapprovingly, was into model trains and bird watching. He'd never served in the army due to a bum knee. Again, something Grandpa told me, although this time he almost said it with regret for the man, like the fella had missed out in life by not having dodged bullets and Nam like Grandpa had. Now, Mrs. James was known as something of a firecracker, and more than once she'd accused newcomers of cheating at bingo and woebetied anyone who promised her bottles of baked goods for various sales and raffles and then didn't end up delivering. And the plan was just to walk up to the front door, slide the card through the mail slot, and then leave. Sometimes we'd knock and spend 5 minutes with Grandma shooting the breeze. But the Jameses weren't really small talk material, just friendly enough to be on the Christmas list. We had just reached the front door when an ear-splitting crash rocked my world and the door splintered outwards. I dove left, Grandma dived right, and it's a miracle neither of us were hit. We were both disoriented from the sound of the shot, which left us with a kind of disorienting tinnitus, and over the din we could hear Mrs. James yelling, seemingly at Mr. James about the hussy he'd been seeing. More shotgun blasts could be heard from inside the house, and Mr. James was arguing in an almost infuriatingly calm voice that Mrs. James needed to be reasonable about this and understand that men have needs and that she meant nothing to him. Now, to this day, I have no idea why Grandma didn't just force us to hightail it back to the car, but she always was a bit of a gossiper. Instead, she encouraged me to crouch down, hidden behind a brick wall, and we listened as the James couple argued with each other, punctuated by shotgun blasts that didn't seem to come close to hitting their targets, but were shooting splinters out of the wooden walls, blowing out windows and all sorts of stuff. Now, how Mr. James had the absolute balls to face down his obviously insane wife, I'll never know. All I can assume is that he was somehow 100% confident that she wouldn't shoot him. However, they had no idea anyone was outside, and while Grandma made me crouch there, gathering the gossip while I trembled in complete terror, another shotgun blast came bursting through the window right above my head. Now, a piece of the buckshot even clipped my ear, I think, and I started screaming, thinking I'd been shot. And that's what shook Grandma out of her lunacy. She had to get her grandson out of there, and get me out of there she did. And with superhuman strength, Grandma swooped me up over her shoulder and power ran toward the car, successfully managed to open the driver's side door and throw me through in one fell swoop. And then she dived in behind me, and finally, we drove around the block from the James' house. Now, these were the days before cell phones, but thankfully someone had called the cops, and suddenly screaming sirens and lights came charging down the street. Grandma said that was our cue to leave because we had too many cards to deliver and not enough time to give a statement to the police, and besides, they'd never even know we were there. A long story short, I had nightmares for months afterwards about delivering Christmas cards that blew up in my hand. Mrs. James was charged with criminal damage, neglect, and mishandling of a firearm, but received a suspended sentence. This was aided by the fact that Mr. James did not press charges, and in fact the couple stayed together after all that ordeal. Grandma and Grandpa avoided them as best as possible at bingo, though, and did not socialize with them anymore. They never admitted to the couple that we'd been there that day, and frankly, I'm glad because I'm not sure that I could have stomached having to face Mrs. James again as she tried to apologize for almost accidentally killing us. We still continued delivering Christmas cards together for the next few years, until my high school studies meant that I was a little too busy to spend as much time with Grandma. But I'm happy to report that after that insane shooting incident, Grandpa removed the Jameses couple from her Christmas list, and we never had to deliver to them again. No, I'm just going to admit this up front. I was an absolute a-hole in college. Like the kind of smug, not quite rich jokester, prankster who thinks he's way funnier than he is. And I'm also glad this was around 15 years ago, because a few years later, and I genuinely think that I would have tried to launch a career as one of those intolerable YouTube pranksters. You know the ones I'm talking about. Now thankfully my pranking days extended solely to being the class clown, and this led to a certain fraternity paying attention to me and encouraging me to pledge, so I did. Honestly, I loved the hazing. I was the one getting pranked, sure, but it made me the center of attention, and I was always up for going a step further than my fellow pledges. Now looking back, I probably came across like the most cringe tryhard imaginable, and the frat bros scouting me out must have thought that they'd lucked out with a clueless gooner like me. Now, I still wonder to this day whether if things had turned out differently, I would have been rejected from the fraternity anyway, and I kind of think that maybe I would have as the ultimate prank. And so when I was doing my initiation, it was back when Amazon had just gotten really big, and with their meteoric rise, we'd also seen a decline in the quality of delivery drivers. It was that weird period between Amazon drivers treating your packages like a Goomba from Mario, and Ring doorbells only existing for the rich and famous. And so regularly, Amazon packages were just free for the taking, dumped into people's yards or left on their front doorsteps ready for some complete idiot like me to come along and swipe them, and then inevitably trash the contents unless it was something really good, which it never was. Now, I must have stolen upwards of 15 packages from poor, stupid Amazon customers. Now, one time I got a box of lingerie, and another time there was this wiener pump, and those are literally the only two remotely interesting things I stole. Mostly I just took people's vitamins, a dog bowl, a little plush toy, and some exercise equipment and other assorted stuff. And then one day, I saw it. A large tantalizing package sitting on a doorstep just there for the taking. It had to be something good, like a microwave oven or a custom kitchen delivery. It just had to be, and I knew it. Now, I could feel it in my bones, so I had my idiot cameraman, another pledge, film me creeping up to do a crab walk in a hoodie and jeans like I was some type of Temu iDubbbz. And then I grasped the package with both hands and yanked it backwards. It exploded. And I don't mean one of those cute glitter bombs that they use now. I mean, it literally exploded. It burned my face and scorched my hoodie, the polyester, right to my skin. No, I was screaming and disoriented and in absolute agony. My cameraman, the coward that he was, had already shrieked and ran away. And then they came, leaping out of the bushes, a group of masked men waiting for me to try to steal that package. Now, I was down for the count, suffering from what felt like third-degree burns, but realistically were probably only first-degree. They felt worse, though, as the masked men started kicking and punching me. They were yelling at me for being a thief, a scum, a criminal. They said I was everything wrong with America, that I was ruining the fabric of this goddamn country. All because I tried to steal an Amazon package as part of a fraternity prank. And you know what? I can't disagree with them. I was a prick, and I deserved a kicking. And I can't say I deserved the shattered eye socket or the permanent limp or the shattered arm that required a metal rod to hold it together, and maybe that punishment was a bit extreme. But at the time, I did convince myself that I deserved it. And the paramedics were called by a neighbor, obviously, long after the masked men had disappeared. But I told them I was jumped by a gang of young people from a rival college, and no, I had no idea who they were, and I preferred that they didn't pursue the crime if possible. And the cops honestly seemed all too happy to oblige. Less work, less paperwork, I guess. And I really did convince myself that I had it coming, and maybe I was right. Maybe I did. But here's the really weird part, though. I went back to that house months later, and I wasn't sure if I'd approach or not, but I decided to just watch from my car for a while. Maybe it had new owners. Maybe this wasn't who I tried to steal the package from. But the people living in the house now were a young family with 2 young kids. None of them seemed like the type to be involved in a violent assault. And so to this day, I don't know if I was targeted by someone related to the household or a group of violent vigilantes who were going after people like me. Now, the latter idea is kind of terrifying because it kind of makes me wonder, what if they decided that I haven't changed my ways enough and come after me again? Now, I've tried my best. I've tried to be a clean living boy, and one thing's for sure. I did not pursue joining that fraternity after all, and a regular dorm room and weekly chess club is all the excitement I want in my life. Thank you very much. I'm a long-haul trucker, proud partner in my 18-wheeler Lucy, and I have been for approximately 18 years. This story I've got to share is from my first few years on the job when I was still a little youngling, excited by everything and not yet world-weary, as they say. I love the CB radio for one, and I'd always have a chat with fellow drivers if anyone was acting particularly talky on a given night. These days, I barely bothered to answer it unless I'm really bored because, frankly, most other people are boring as dog crap and I have no interest in what they have to say. Now back then, though, there was this other trucker who'd often be yammering away on the CB, mostly to himself. He went by the name of Boxcar Willie, I guess probably after that singer. Now we didn't use real names, we just had call signs. Mine was effing Ironhide, like the Transformer, but also because I thought that I was a clever bastard calling myself Ironhide when I spent 80% of my working hours sitting on my butt driving that truck. Boxcar Willie isn't hugely important to the story, but he is important, so just bear with me. Now, when this all began, me and Boxcar Willie were chatting away about some of the dumbest crap imaginable. Aliens, Bigfoot, chupacabras, all that kind of stuff. And to this day, I don't know if he was screwing with me, but Willie claimed that not only did he believe in all of this stuff, he had evidence of it in the remote trailer he lived in when he wasn't off trucking. Occasionally another trucker would chime in to let me know that Boxcar Willie was full of dog do and he was just winding me up. But Willie played it dead straight. He swore blind that he'd come face to face with Bigfoot one time when he'd had to stop for that hairy fella in the middle of the dark mountain road. But Christ, who knows? The point is, all this talk about Bigfoot and cryptids for some reason made me hungry as hell, so when the next rest stop sign lit up, I decided that I was just going to pull in and get myself the biggest hot dog man has ever seen, or at least the biggest one that the gas station sold. So that's exactly what I did. The dogs had clearly been cooking on that spinning grill for way longer than is healthy, and they looked about as appetizing as a shrunken head, but I didn't care. I got 2 of them. Piled them ass-high with onions, mustard, and ketchup, and then threw in one of those crushed ice slushies, a huge one, and fumbled my way back to my truck. I pulled out of that rest stop and proudly told Boxcar Willie and whoever else was listening that I just landed the best pair of dogs this side of the Midwest. I may have been exaggerating on that title a little, and weren't they just jealous? Now, of course, Willie had a story about this one time that he found a roadside hot dog seller who only appeared once every 10 years or some nonsense. He was entertaining if nothing else, biggest liar you ever met who wasn't a politician. Now anyway, my route is pretty straight and clear for the next 100 miles, so I'm feeling pretty safe about munching down on one of my overcooked dogs, wrapped in a bun that was even more disappointingly stale than I'd hoped for. And that's when I heard it, a noise from behind me from inside the trailer. Of course I made the mistake of telling Boxcar Willie, who began to psych me up with tales of cryptids and ghouls who preyed on truckers. Now naturally this was a load of horse manure, but I was unsettled by the sound, if only because I was driving an extremely straight bit of road and I didn't like the idea that some cargo actually came loose. Now after a while the sound stopped and I figured whatever it was had kind of sorted itself out. Now I forget what I was carrying at the time, but it was kind of a heavy electrical goods situation that couldn't really easily get damaged, so I paid it no mind and carried on driving. And then I heard some more noise from behind me. I listened real hard, but by now I'm convinced that there are footsteps in the back of the trailer. I mentioned this to Willie, who of course has a story of something similar, only this one gets under my skin and actually spooks me. Can't even remember the crap that he shared at the time. Now on top of that, I'd finished my hot dog, drank way too much of my slushie, and I needed to piss. And there was no rest stop for miles, so I pulled onto the shoulder, scanned the darkness for any vehicles. There clearly were none coming for quite a few solid minutes and got out. I took a piss first. I didn't want to pee myself in fear at whatever might be in that trailer. And then I examined the trailer itself. It was fully locked and sealed in a completely satisfactory manner, really. And the idea that someone had gotten in while I was getting my gross hot dogs was really unlikely. And yet, I pulled open the back doors of the trailer, about to yell "gotcha," almost as a joke to myself, and as soon as I started to pull open those doors, they came flying towards me, and I had to leap backwards to avoid getting smacked. An absolutely deranged, elderly woman came leaping out. She was wearing torn-up jeans and an absolutely filthy bra. Nothing else. In her hand, she was gripping my X-Acto knife that I kept in the trailer in case I needed to slice through any of the plastic ties that kept boxes in place. And this woman, I swear to God, hissed at me and lunged at me, and with a strength way unexpected for a woman of seemingly her age. She shoved me onto my ass so hard that I had a bruised tailbone for a week, and then she swiped at me with that X-Acto knife, more of a warning than anything else, and disappeared around the side of the cab. Now, I'm not one to get knocked on my butt by anyone, let alone a methed-out granny, so I scrambled to my feet and headed to that cab. Instead of being long gone, the old woman was sitting in the driver's seat, munching away on my second hot dog, and a look of pure bliss is on her face. I slammed the driver's side door shut, locked it with the fob from outside, and then called the cops. Thankfully, I did actually have service. And it took them over an hour to show up, during which time I watched as the meth-head grandma ate my hot dog, finished my slushie, and then just fell asleep behind the wheel of my 18-wheeler. And when the cops finally got there, they picked her up. They couldn't get any straight answer out of her about how she'd gotten into my trailer, and she apparently couldn't even speak English at all. I checked the cargo, and she'd done no damage to anything back there, so when the cops asked if I wanted to press any charges for assault, I just decided against that, so long as they made sure that she got the help that she clearly needed. Plus, I had a deadline to make, and I was already a whole bunch behind schedule. As I finished my delivery, I shared that story with the CB radio, and you can best believe that Boxcar Willie had some kind of bat crap story about a ghostly woman who matched her description. But this time, it was the first time I could see through the fact he was clearly making it up on the fly. His silly ghost stories were nothing compared to the real fear of facing down an unhinged woman being with a sharp weapon, never knowing how they'll react. I hope the old lady got the support she needed. I try not to think about how she got into my trailer. I'm pretty sure she must have snuck in when I originally loaded the cargo, which meant that she'd been back there for a good 6 hours before I caught her. Now, I'm just glad things played out the way they did, and some poor worker boy at the end station didn't end up taking a blade to the throat. Now, people are strange, scary, and weird, and that's why these days I keep to myself, and instead of spending all my time answering the CB, I've learned to appreciate the solitude that being a trucker allows. This happened to my dad back in the 1960s, and he's given me permission to share it with you. He worked as a paperboy for quite a few years back in the days when kids made a decent living hurling papers from their bikes as they cycled past. Dad, however, went that extra mile. They actually stopped at every house and gently placed the paper on the front stoop. It made him a real popular paperboy, and come Christmas time, he'd often find a little thank you card and a tip pinned to the door of some of his deliveries. Now, one woman took a real shine to him, I guess. A real shine, as it was around February, and for the first time ever, this old woman was waiting on the porch for him. She invited him in for a drink and a vague insinuation that there would be a financial reward following that, i.e., a tip. And so Dad, the naive little kid he was, followed the old woman into her house and drank a drink with her. Now, the next thing he knows, he's suddenly waking up tied to a dining room chair, and the old woman is cavorting in front of him, naked as the day she was born, rambling about how she'd been craving a man's touch. Of course, Dad's like 8 years old at this point and totally horrified by everything that's going on. Thankfully, also being an 8-year-old, he's able to squeeze his way out of the pathetic knots that this perverted old hag has tied around him, and so screaming bloody murder, Dad manages to pull himself free from the naked old woman's dining chair and then basically fling himself from the house, leap onto his bike, and catapult himself through town back to the grocery store that he worked for. And when he got there, the owner took him aside and, a weird turn of events, offered him $10, a hell of a lot of money back then, to keep quiet about the whole ordeal. Now, he promised he wouldn't have to deliver papers to that old woman again as long as he kept quiet and accepted the money. Of course, Dad being the dumb 8-year-old, he just took the deal without a moment's hesitation. It's become something of a family legend now, and the woman passed away not long after, and we never did find out the cause, motive, or twist behind any of it. We have no idea why she decided my dad would be the perfect male touch for her, and frankly, none of us wanted to know. It's just one of those things. There are weird people out there. Be careful, especially of strange old women. So something absolutely insane happened to me the other day, and I don't know who else to tell other than the cops, obviously, which I haven't done, and I hope you'll understand why. It was like 10 p.m. and I was just hanging out at home alone. My girlfriend was studying, so she wasn't over that night, and I heard a crash from outside and just kind of dismissed it as being the usual neighborhood crap. And then there was a knock at the door. I was a bit unsettled, obviously. I don't live in the safest neighborhood in the world, and so I looked through the peephole, and there's a pizza delivery guy standing there wearing what is clearly the uniform of a very famous pizza delivery brand. I can see over his shoulder that he has a branded delivery van as well, so okay, cool, seems pretty safe. But I didn't order pizza. Maybe my girlfriend did as a sort of treat, so I opened the door to the guy and began to explain to him that I didn't order that myself. Was there maybe some kind of note? Was it definitely the right address, etc.? Now the guy just looks at me, removes the hot pizza from his bag, and then hurls the entire pie straight in my face. Now, it would have been comical if not for the fact it was searing hot. There was melted lava cheese running down my face, and I was suddenly freaking out in fight or flight mode due to the unexpected sudden assault. And I tried to mumble what the F through the pizza that's now dripping off my face and reach up to try and wipe the hot cheese out of my eyes. And that's when the delivery driver aims a swift, hefty kick straight between my legs, kicking me square in the nuts. Now, naturally, I doubled over in absolute agony, which at least had the bonus effect of causing any remnant pizza to droop off my face. And I'm just there gasping for air, gripping the side of the door, suddenly convinced that this lunatic driver is some kind of pizza-based serial killer is going to plunge a knife deep into my chest. Now, I tried to mumble and ask what the hell was going on, and then I distinctly and clearly hear this pizza guy, who I swear to God sounds like that acne-ridden teen from The Simpsons, go, "This is for my mother, you scum-suck psycho." I'm just absolutely floored. I have no idea who this guy is, or who his mother is, or what I've done to her. Possibilities start running through my head, but I barely have time to consider them when he sort of croaks and squeaks and then says, Oh, I'm so sorry. I've come to this wrong address. I'm so sorry." I managed to look up through tears of pain to see him run through my yard and leap into his very clearly branded pizza delivery car, and then he drives away at full speed. And that's when I realized that the crash I heard from earlier was this delivery psycho driving over my mailbox. And so I went inside and cleaned myself up and thankfully realized that I haven't suffered any serious damage from the scalding pizza to my face. And so naturally the first thing I do is call up my local pizza place that had that name and ask them if they had a delivery driver in the area. Apparently they'd been expecting my call because the girl in the other end of the line, who sounds like a pretty young person herself, suddenly starts begging me not to call the cops and apologizing over and over, saying that if I knew the full story, I'd understand. Now I asked the girl to tell me the full story and she just said she can't. But if I promise not to call the cops, my next 3 pizzas will be free, and then I can order another free pizza every 6 months. And I genuinely weighed the option. I mean, it would be insane to take them up on that offer, right? But I'm a broke college student at the time. No harm was done. I have a funny story to tell friends, and I'm getting multiple free pizzas out of this deal. Plus, if someone has screwed with my mom in the way that was serious enough to cause this guy to act like this, I guess I can probably sympathize. And so I didn't call the cops, and I took them up on the offer of the free pizzas. The first one arrived tonight. Do you think I did the right thing? I guess I'm just kind of easily bought. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. Now, if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. You should check it out. All links in the descriptions below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, can AI do this?
They told me Oz was just a story. A fairy tale my grandmother dreamed up after the storm.
How do you know Dorothy?
I don't.
Then why are you here? For nearly 20 years. Since I've known her, she can't have said more than 4 words to me.
My mother tried to bury our secret. She called it family madness.
Are you ready for today's session?
But you can't hide from something that knows your name.
Now we'll begin.
She said she saved me by hiding Oz, abandoning it, leaving it to die so that I might live. I see their faces, the witches, the patched-together creature, the man made of tin, the wheeler.
Stay away from us!
I see the same yellow brick road, the same shadows, voices calling from behind the wind. Now Oz is awake again. And whatever began with my grandmother is coming back to finish with me.
Hey friends, what you just saw was the trailer for Gale, Yellow Brick Road, and it's being produced by our good friend Dane over on the YouTube channel Being Scared. It's an amazing and horrifying reimagining of a classic story we all know and love, but it's only going to be in theaters for one night only, February 11th, so it would mean the world to everyone involved if you snagged a ticket as soon as you can. The website to grab a ticket will be in the description and pinned comment below. Thanks. I don't think I fit the picture that people imagine when I say lesbian GameStop manager, but that's who I am. I wasn't a manager when this happened, just a lesbian GameStop. And it was when I had been at GameStop for about a year and a half, at around October 2014 when I was about 22. We were still in the era where a conventionally feminine female gamer was something of an oddity, at least in my town, and we're long past that, thank God, but it could get a bit tiresome. Now, you're probably imagining my story is going to involve the worst in a long line of terrifying incel male gamers hitting on me at work after crawling out of mom's basement. Now, maybe that happened occasionally, but honestly, in my experience, that whole stereotype is just played up and played out and nowhere near as common as people think. And now your listeners are going to be calling fake or plant or whatever, but I swear, this has always been my genuine experience. I know there are plenty of weird gamer bros out there, but well, I think this story itself is proof of why you can simply never tell who's going to be like what. It was October, and GameStop were bringing in some extra staff ready for Christmas, and particularly the release of GTA 5 on PS4 and Xbox One that month. and so I wasn't surprised to see one or two new faces, but I was surprised when one of them was another girl. I was glad that I'd have someone for some girl talk, and what I wasn't looking for was a relationship. I was with someone at the time, so I didn't even consider that's where her mind could have instantly been going. She was a bit shorter than me, with a nose ring and a bad green, blue, and pink dye job to her badly cut hair. It's easy to be uncharitable now because I know what kind of person Amanda is, but I hope I didn't cast judgment on her at the time. She was just a normal, young, alternative girl, really. It's just now looking back that she developed into a monster in my mind because she truly is one. Amanda was really intensely friendly with me, but in a way she tried to hide with some very sarcastic ambivalence. I didn't pick up on this at the time, I just felt a bit confused. It was like she was bursting at the seams to get to know me, but wanted to play it cool and act like she didn't care. She had this weird way of speaking where she'd start out talking really fast, and then slow down after the first sentence like she was mentally putting the brakes on. Kind of like Nardwuar. Now, when we first met, she'd rushed over ahead of our manager, Dan, and already introduced herself. She abruptly gave me a hug, which took me aback. Coworkers didn't just typically hug me, so I wasn't used to it happening all of a sudden. Also, I'm not particularly a huggy person when it comes to strangers, especially. And she told me she was Amanda, even though Dan had already introduced her. And then she said something like, "We're going to be working together. Isn't that so cool?" Now, she said this like we knew each other from school or something, like we were old friends. Now, I probably paused too long scanning her face, trying to place if I actually did know her. Now, she told me that we'd gone to high school together, and I had this very sinking feeling. Had I shared classes with this girl and completely forgotten or ignored her? And then she added that she came to GameStop all the time. Now, it later turned out that the reason that I didn't remember her from high school was that she'd started her freshman year when I was a senior. Now, we didn't have classes together or even know each other or have mutual friends or anything like that. We'd simply attended the same high school for 1 year. And of course, because we were both women, I was put in charge of Amanda. Now, showing her the ropes and teaching her how to work the register, how to take inventory, the usual, I was kind of flattered that they trusted me enough to have another employee shadowing me, since I hadn't even worked there myself for 2 years. Now, things were fine with Amanda at first, if a little intense. She'd always stand right next to me when I showed her things, kind of pressed up against me, and she was almost a head shorter than me, but sometimes she'd lean in so close that I could even smell her breath. And God, her breath reeked. I don't know what it was. It wasn't standard bad breath. It was something that she'd eaten. I'm sure of it. Like boiled eggs or something, but I never actually saw her eating egg. It was unpleasant to the point of unbearable, and it took all my willpower not to recoil away on more than one occasion. Now, Amanda just did not click with me. I didn't enjoy her company or find her interesting to talk to. Amanda felt differently, though. She would constantly find excuses to talk to me or hang around on break and during work hours, and she would talk non-stop about things she liked or movies she'd seen or bands she listened to and, of course, games she played. Now, I very quickly noticed a pattern with all the things that she talked about. She was constantly telling me things that she liked or hated, just bombarding me with information about things like she was trying to force her tastes on me in the weirdest of ways. She never stopped to ask if I'd listened to said band or watched said movie or what my opinions were on any of the things that she was talking about. She would just sort of go on about how much she liked, say, One Direction or The Conjuring or Marvel movies or some such. I didn't really pick up on it at the time, but there was no defining genres or themes or any personalities to her tastes. It was like she was just sort of naming random popular things at the time to talk about that had no connection to one another or painted any real picture of her identity. If you've ever met someone like this, you'll know what I mean. Like they're not a real person. She obviously did watch the movies and listen to the bands and play the games, but she would talk about them relentlessly. She usually loved the things she talked about, but occasionally hated them to the point of almost unsettling rage. But it was just the most bland, wide-ranging set of subjects, like someone Googled popular things and was just checking them off. Now, eventually I had enough, and I had to ask Amanda to chill and give me a bit of space, and it was kind of driving me insane. I sort of expected her to take it badly. Now, what I didn't expect her to do was try and kill me and then act like nothing happened. I would cycle to and from work in those days. I had a license, but my apartment was close and I didn't want the cost of vehicle upkeep, and so I always kept my bike in great condition. But one night, cycling home in the dark, my brakes failed at the bottom of a hill and I came skidding off into the gutter. Now, it could have been much, much worse. There was one intersection on the way home and that could have been lethal. I know those brakes had been screwed with. They hadn't been cut or anything. The nuts were just loose, causing the grip to slip and not function immediately. Just the type of thing that I was pretty meticulous about checking when I did my weekly upkeep on the bike. Now, I didn't mention the bike incident to anyone at work because I didn't have proof, and I could have been completely wrong. But it was just a couple of days after that when Amanda's demeanor towards me completely changed. She was still as overly friendly as possible, still forcing her company onto me whenever she could at work, albeit slightly less often, but this is where things did a 180 to become intrusive. Instead of ranting at me about pieces of pop culture, she suddenly switched to relentless questioning. What movies had I watched that week? What games was I playing? What's my favorite song? Who are my favorite bands? What shows were good? What did I recommend? Just constantly a barrage of questions. There was no pause to take in information or to discuss anything I brought up. She wasn't actually listening to my answers, or at least I didn't think so. And soon, what felt like a spark of interest became insulting, and I realized that it wasn't worth answering properly because she didn't actually care. And so I'd give a brief, abrupt answers to pretend that I hadn't heard, and then she started asking about things that weren't pop culture related. Where did I live? Did I like anyone at work? Who had I dated in high school? Stuff like that. And thankfully, that only went on for a couple of days and I managed to avoid having to give her any personal information. But good Lord, I didn't think that I could have taken this for long without snapping. Now, I'm not sure why I decided to answer her, and so confidently too, when she asked me if I had a partner. I don't know if I was hoping that maybe she had a whole bunch of homophobia waiting in the wings and would just leave me alone when she found out that I was gay. I have no idea why I'd have assumed that she didn't already know, and so I told her I'd been with Laura, my girlfriend, since 2012, and we were thinking of moving in together. Amanda, I swear to God, went white. She literally started trembling slightly, and I was actually concerned that she was having a seizure or something. Now I asked her if she was okay. Amanda nodded, staring at me in a deep, intent way that gave me chills to this day. And then suddenly she blurted out some kind of sentiment like, "I'm so happy for you," and swept me up in a huge, overly tight, uncomfortable hug and then stepped back, beaming, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Now this was obviously the point that I knew something was very off about Amanda. Thankfully, she wouldn't be in my life much longer, but it gets oh so worse before it gets better. Amanda became absolutely obsessed with The Last of Us. Now that sounds par for the course in 2024, but back then the sequel wasn't yet out, and we had the original and then the remastered version on PS4 and Xbox, and Amanda actually bought a copy of The Last of Us Remastered that same day, but I thought nothing of it at all. Why would I? Everyone was buying it. Now one day, Amanda walked up to me in the break room and literally thrust that Last of Us box into my face. Now, I remember what she said next precisely because it was so insane. "I would love a relationship like that. Someone who will fight through the zombie apocalypse for me." Then she paused. "With a girl," she added, staring intently at me. She had this real piercing yet blank stare. This expectant stare that says everything and nothing all at once, and the more you get to know the person, the more vacant and creepy it seems. Now, I said that was cool, something vaguely dismissive. She says, "I think I'd make a good lesbian." I just responded in silence. "Yeah, I think I'd be good at pleasuring other girls." What? I was still in silence. I'm attracted to girls. To other girls." Now me in silence, and at this point I am cringing internally so hard my ovaries feel like they're gonna explode. "Yes, I realize that I'm attracted to girls because..." And as she began to say this, blessed Hail Mary, the door opened and our coworker Matt walked in. Now Matt is the goofy, cheerful type who takes nothing seriously, and you can never really get mad at him thanks to that. "Hey, I'm also attracted to girls," he said jovially. Now, I could have kissed him at that point for absolutely decimating the tension. Man, if hateful looks could kill, though. Amanda could have been on trial for murder at that point, as she glared at Matt in a way that I'd never seen anyone glare at anyone else before. Even Matt, completely unfazed by anything, stopped in his tracks. He was clearly taken aback and asked if something was wrong. I protested, laughing, and insisted emphatically that it wasn't. And anyway, my break was over and I was due to get back on the store floor. Now that night, I called Matt up and decided to finally tell someone else at work how uncomfortable Amanda was beginning to make me. Now, up until now, I just kept it to myself and Laura because I'd feel like crap if I'd affected someone else's employment because they made me personally uncomfortable. But today had just been super weird and creepy, and like Laura said, we'd be expected to immediately act if a guy behaved like that towards a woman. Matt wasn't dismissive. He actually took it very seriously and said that he'd help me swap shifts if I needed to avoid Amanda, and that in the meantime, I should stick near him and he'd make sure that I wasn't caught alone with Amanda at work. And to this day, I really appreciated that. A week later, I received the first note. I found it in my jacket pocket when I got home one day after work. "You're a cock-teasing little bitch. Stop leading me on. From Matt," it said. And so I showed it to Laura, and then I called up Matt and told him what Amanda had done. Because of course it was freaking Amanda, not Matt. Now we decided to wait and try to catch Amanda in the act, and it was the only way to ensure that something could be done. There was no real danger of anyone actually believing the notes were from Matt, but there would be no way to prove that they were from Amanda either. It took another 2 weeks and another 3 notes before we caught Amanda at it. Now, during that time, I made a point of avoiding Matt. No confrontations, no mention of anything, but I wanted to give the impression that I was at least wary and buying it. And the second note had also slipped into my pocket during work. This one said something about me being a series of slurs that applied to queer people and how I'll burn in hell. And the next note was taped to the seat of my bike and said much of the same. Only, this time it was written on some toilet paper, unused thankfully. In the end, we caught her by pure freaking chance. We've been trying to come up with a great plan to catch her in the act, and in the end, we just walked in on her slipping the note inside this Tupperware container that held my lunch. Of course, she tried to protest immediately. She'd seen Matt putting something in my lunch, so she wanted to check it out. I said I didn't believe her, so she tried to stab me in the eye with a fork. 1 minute I was yelling at her, and the next minute, a fork was flying towards my face, held by a snarling Amanda, and she went from 1 to 100 in a second. I tried to fight her off, holding her wrist, trying to keep the fork away from my freaking face. With her other hand, she was clawing at my stomach, trying to... I don't know. She knew I had a belly button piercing, and she was trying to rip it out. I shoved her away hard, and she slammed against the refrigerator. I looked for something. Anything I could grab, and there it was. A Master Chief replica helmet that a manager had put in the break room. And he was so proud of that thing, and we weren't supposed to touch it on pain of death. But I figured he'd probably understand when the alternative was my death. And so I snatched up that Master Chief helmet, the pride of GameStop, and swung it as hard as I could straight into Amanda's face. The helmet crunched, and so did her nose. Blood exploded over the prop replica. Amanda hooted and tried to lunge at me with that fork again, and I swear to God, this was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I'll never get it back. I swung my leg back and planted a kick right into her crotch, as hard as I freaking could. She dropped like a sack of potatoes. The manager came rushing in after hearing the commotion, and so did Matt. It wasn't hard to prove that there was no way Matt could have put the note in my lunch, and circled back around to the shop floor, met up with me, and then re-entered the break room. There were witnesses. And when Amanda started yelling about how Matt had confided in her that he was obsessed with me and how I kept rejecting him, well, that's when we didn't even have to try proving her guilt anymore. And so I asked her why she tried to stab me in the eye with a fork, and her answer was, to protect me from Matt. You literally could not make this stuff up. One other funny twist to this, though, is because Amanda never bothered to actually learn anything about me, the object of her obsession, she had no idea that Matt is my first cousin. And so that's how my weird, creepy, obsessive GameStop coworker got fired, for trying to frame my cousin for harassing me. Obviously, the cops got involved, and Amanda was going to be charged with harassment and attempted assault. And in the end, though, we had to settle out of court because I'd smashed her face in with that Spartan 117 helmet, and while things would have likely turned out in my favor, I didn't want to go through the prolonged court case when we could just settle. At least she was banned from the mall, though. Now, I found Amanda on Facebook a couple of years ago. Obviously, I didn't add her, but it was remarkable to see how much she'd visually changed. She married to a man and has 2 very young kids, and I really hope that she's changed as a person and isn't an insane melting pot just waiting to bubble over. I hope she dealt with whatever sickness caused her to act the way she did towards me. When I last looked on her Facebook, which she keeps publicly visible to all, I saw that she'd recently become the youngest ever board member of her area's local HOA. So as to whether she's less crazy now, who can honestly say? This is a pretty messed up story about something that happened to me in the late 2000s. This is the first time I put it all down on paper, even though I've shared this story privately a lot, so please bear with me. In the fall of 2008, I was in my senior year of high school in a small town near Atlanta. I just turned 18 and was a typical outgoing girl, I guess. Nothing really remarkable about me. I was just normal. I did gymnastics, I was dating a football player, not the team captain, but a solid player, and we weren't on track to be prom king and queen, but we were pretty popular and friendly kids. And I wasn't a beauty queen, but I was happy with how I looked. I always imagined that you had to be a really extra special to get a hyper-obsessed, dangerous stalker, and I couldn't have been more wrong. And I guess that's why I didn't take it too seriously when it started. Friday, September 26th. That date is ingrained into my mind because I've had to repeat it so many times in retellings and reports, and that's the day it started. The day Logan Nelson added me to MySpace. I didn't recognize him, but I accepted his friend request right away. And I wasn't very picky back then, and online security was far from a concern for my stupid self. Oh hey, someone who wants to be your friend? So you click accept and get the thrill of number go up. Now I knew from the outset that this Logan Nelson's profile wasn't him. It was MySpace Tom crudely photoshopped with Joker makeup. And I guess MySpace Tom as the Joker amused me, so I accepted Logan's friend request and thought nothing of it. Later, I got an alert about a post on my MySpace wall. It was from Logan. And he said something like, "Hey, seen you around school, you seem cool." And I just replied asking if we had any classes together. Now, he replied with a simple yes, which was unhelpful, so I stopped replying and went ahead with enjoying my weekend. Saturday was the last barbecue of the year with the family and my boyfriend Kyle's fam, and the weather would be turning soon, so it'd be a time to put the grill into storage for the winter. My Uncle Chris, Dad's brother, famously grilled a mean steak, and our barbecues would inevitably turn into large neighborhood events, with dozens of people coming and going throughout the afternoon and evening. Towards the end of the night, when the various kids in attendance had settled down and things were a bit quieter, Kyle came up to me and asked who Logan was. I didn't immediately remember the guy who added me to MySpace, so I asked for some context, and Kyle let me inside and showed me a note stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, and it said, "Hey Sandy, you look great today. Good enough to eat. Logan." Creepy. So I remembered Logan Nelson from MySpace and told Kyle about him, and we tried to work out who Logan Nelson was and if we'd seen him at the barbecue. Now Kyle eventually figured out that Logan could be this quiet, unassuming kid who had a few classes with us. He dropped by the barbecue at some time in the evening, Kyle said. This kid, if I was thinking of the right guy, was a band geek type. Certainly didn't strike me as the type of guy to leave a smutty message on my family refrigerator. And that night I posted on his MySpace wall asking if he'd left a message. And his reply was, "Well, yeah, you like it?" I didn't say yes or no, but asked if he was Logan from Chem in Spanish. "Lol, yeah," came the response. Mystery solved. Strange, creepy, and annoying, but solved. Kyle and I confronted Logan the next time we had class together. Logan was absolutely baffled and said he'd never put anything on the refrigerator. Kyle kind of got up in his face, and I swear Logan was about to piss himself. He had been at the barbecue but swore he hadn't stuck a note on the refrigerator, wasn't interested in me like that, quote unquote, and anyway, his name was Logan Baumgartner, not Logan Nelson. Kyle wasn't so sure, so I managed to talk him down, which is lucky because I think he was about ready to pound Logan Baumgartner into the dirt. And that evening when I came home from school, Dad and Uncle Chris were watching the game. I asked Dad if he'd seen anyone come into the house during the barbecue, and the house was typically out of bounds during our BBQs except for people using the bathroom, so people went in and out but wouldn't linger. Dad couldn't recall seeing anyone in particular, but Chris said Kyle and a couple of his buddies had been hanging around the kitchen. Obviously, Kyle hadn't seen anyone suspicious, but I called him later that night and asked if he could check with his buddies, or see if any of them recalled the note on the refrigerator to try and pinpoint exactly when it had been posted. I was beginning to feel like a crack detective, and then everything simply cracked. The next evening, Logan Nelson posted on my MySpace wall saying something about how he wanted to see my insides. Now anyways, this was pretty clear in a concise thread, so I told my dad and Uncle Chris. Now they were both absolutely fuming. Uncle Chris, who at the time was working night security, offered to swing by the house regularly on his off nights and keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. No less than 2 days later, while me and my family were blissfully asleep, Chris reported catching an intruder peeping into my bedroom window. He'd leaped out of the car and gave chase, but this black-clad figure had apparently given him the slip while leaping through neighbors' gardens and over back fences into their yards. Chris had returned to his car and sat outside our house for the rest of the night, until we were up and awake and he could let us know what had just happened. I didn't really understand why at the time, but we decided not to call the cops the first time, and I was told that Chris and Dad decided that it would be better if we just handled it ourselves. This didn't make me feel very safe, but they knew best. And by this point, I blocked Logan Nelson on MySpace, but I kept receiving dozens of spam requests. I'd also received random friend requests and abusive messages on every messenger program I used, and it was really starting to terrify me, this guy watching me from somewhere. What about the nights when Uncle Chris couldn't keep an eye on the house? This guy could be outside looking in, and maybe one day he'd break in and take things further. I expressed my fear to Dad and Uncle Chris and suggested again that we just call the cops. Dad was taking my side, but Uncle Chris said that he had 2 weeks vacation from work and would be able to monitor the house a lot better. Now he suggested that we could handle the guy our way, and this seemed to win Dad over. They'd always been those kind of brothers. The spam and abuse online kept coming. Different accounts every day, different threats to my email before I blocked each and every one, threats of violence and worse, and it was driving me nuts and making me feel so unsafe. I begged Dad again to call the cops, and he finally agreed. Unfortunately, my paranoid ass had been deleting most of the emails and messages from the stalker, but I kept the note from the refrigerator and a couple of the latest emails. Dad and I took them to the station that afternoon. The female cop I saw was really helpful and sympathetic. Unfortunately, she explained that there wasn't much they could do with what we had, but told us to keep collecting information and evidence. They did take the note away for processing, but we'd all handled it so there really wasn't much of a chance of finding fingerprints or anything. That night, I awoke to a loud commotion in the backyard. The clock read after 2 in the morning, and I grabbed a robe and covered myself and then looked out. Uncle Chris was standing in the back, yelling and waving some kind of bat. Dad and I rushed outside. Chris was out there with a neighbor hollering about an intruder. When he calmed down, he told us that he'd caught a figure in a hoodie peering through my bedroom window. He tried to sneak up on that intruder but startled him and the guy ran off again. Then the neighbor came out, saw Uncle Chris in the backyard, thought that he was an intruder, and began to threaten him. Eventually everyone calmed down and Chris was trying to get Dad and the neighbor to go canvassing the streets with him, but in the end, they decided the guy must be long gone. Now the next few days were hell. The online abuse ramped up, and it seemed like no matter how many accounts I blocked, a new one would message me, and now the abuse had become more targeted too. Very few people knew this, but in my sophomore year, I suffered from an eating disorder and even spent a few weeks in a clinic during the summer break. I'd recovered fully, and only those closest to me knew about it, but it had been a long and hard road to get over, and at times I still felt those intrusive thoughts coming back. And so it was pretty unwelcome when my stalkers started calling me fat and obese, a pig, and a disgusting flesh monster, all sorts of lovely things. "That dress you wore today doesn't fit you very well. Maybe try 10 sizes up," they'd say. "Didn't know that they let pigs into our high school. Saw you in the cafeteria stuffing your face today. Disgusting." I hadn't even eaten in the freaking cafeteria that day. I hadn't eaten anything because the weight paranoia was coming back thanks to this stalker. Now, we filed reports with the cops about all this online abuse, but back in 2008, being an online target wasn't taken seriously at all by the law, even if the cops were sympathetic. And since we only had Uncle Chris's eyewitness account of a potential intruder, it was hard to escalate things legally. Now, Kyle tried his best to make me feel better, constantly telling me that I was beautiful and I shouldn't listen. And he knew about the eating disorder, of course, although we hadn't started dating yet when I was hospitalized for it. Kyle's attempts weren't really working, though, and I was falling back into the rabbit hole of hating myself. Now, one morning, I found a huge cake shoved into our mailbox. Flies were swarming around it, and the entire space in the mailbox was filled with disgusting cream frosting and stale baked goods. Now, it must have been done before our mail arrived because the mailman alerted us about it. And that same day, I received a bunch of spam emails asking if I enjoyed the cake, with things like oink oink written in them and then photos of pigs. Uncle Chris was still on his vacation days, so he promised to up his patrols, and he said he hadn't been there the night before due to a date, which I couldn't really hold against him. That night, though, every time I peeked out my window, I saw him sitting in his car, either reading or napping, and it did make me feel safer. But what a fool I was, as if anything was keeping me safe. Now, it was past 4 this time when I was woken up by a commotion. More than a commotion, actually. A rock came hurtling through my window, smashing the glass and sending a shard flying right past my leg and even cutting me slightly. I screamed and ran into the house. Mom and my siblings were already cowering in the living room, and Dad was unlocking the gun cabinet. I'd completely forgotten my little sidearm in my bedroom safe, so much for that. And Dad ran outside, and against my mom's wishes, I followed him. Uncle Chris was out there again, and this time surrounded by a bunch of neighbors. Chris had a wild story to tell. He'd driven to the Piggly Wiggly to grab some snacks and got caught up chatting to the kid working the register. Now, Uncle Chris was kind of like that. He could somehow strike up a conversation with anyone, and so he drove back to his stakeout and caught a creeper staring into my window again. And without thinking, Uncle Chris said that he leaped out of his car, swiped up a rock, and hurled it at the intruder. He missed, of course, and that's what had smashed my window. Uncle Chris himself had actually thrown that rock. Of course, this drew the neighbors out again, and a few of the neighbor guys were scouring the area for that black-clad intruder that Uncle Chris described. Chris was really riled up, waving his gun around as he spoke, and Dad had to take him to one side and tell him to calm down before somebody got shot. He'd already thrown a rock through my bedroom window, which Dad was pissed at him about. It was impossible for any of us to get to sleep that night, and not really worth trying as the sun would soon be up. Now, my younger siblings did go back to bed, so did my mom, but Dad, Uncle Chris, and I sat in the kitchen just drinking coffee, and I thought that we were waiting for the cops to arrive, but apparently I was wrong. And that's when Uncle Chris dropped a bombshell. He said that he couldn't be sure. He stressed this over and over again, but he wanted to tell me just in case. He said that when he threw the rock, that peeping Tom had turned and his mask had slipped, and Chris had gotten a glimpse of a face that he was sure was Kyle. My boyfriend, Kyle. Kyle, my boyfriend, my stalker? Could it be? Now, I thought about it. None of the online abuse had come through exactly when I was with Kyle, and the note had been left on the refrigerator when Kyle was in and out of the house. Kyle knew about my eating disorder. But why? Why would Kyle, the guy I loved, do this to me? No, Uncle Chris had to be wrong. Kyle wouldn't have the time or energy to make all these fake accounts, do all this harassment, shove a cake into my mailbox. Uncle Chris could have seen any white, normal-looking teenage boy and jumped to conclusions, and Kyle wouldn't do this to me. I mean, he wouldn't, would he? Now, I didn't want to raise the issue with Kyle. I was still very insecure, and I was worried that even asking him about it might cause him to break up with me. It's dumb, I know, and Kyle must have been able to tell that I was distant with him, though, because he asked what was up between us when he called me on Friday night. And I just broke down and told him how bad I was feeling because of the stalker, how insecure and scared that I was, and I mentioned that I felt so unsafe at school, knowing that this guy was watching me from somewhere at every turn, and wanted to try to fish for any clues that Kyle might feel guilty. And that's when Kyle pointed out something interesting. He said something like, "Well, the stalker hasn't actually done anything at school, right?" And when I thought about it, he was right. All the harassment had taken place in and around my home, and I never received any anonymous notes in my locker, nothing slipped into my coat or bag during school. And the stalker had left a note in my home, filled the mailbox with cake, and been caught lurking around my bedroom window by Uncle Chris a couple of times. "There's no actual proof he goes to school with us," Kyle had said. And then I thought about the messages. They would be sent to my email, my MySpace profile, Friendster, etc., and I never really paid attention to when they were posted, just when I received them, which was after I returned home from school. I've been saving them for the police reports, so I went back and checked while on the phone with Kyle, and the messages that were timed or dated had all been posted at random times throughout the day, although never mid-morning. Whoever it was knew certain details, though, like what I'd worn to school some days, and then Kyle reminded me about other details that were wrong, like the time the stalker had given me crap for stuffing my face in the cafeteria when I hadn't even eaten my lunch in the cafeteria that day. And this revelation didn't make things better, though. If anything, it just widened the pool of suspects to an almost impossible size. Now, this really caused me to start panicking, and I broke down on the phone and started crying and hyperventilating. Kyle insisted that he was coming over there and then, and we lived across town, and it was nearly midnight, so I told him not to. But he was insistent. He wanted to check on me, so I hung up the phone and waited for him. I'm feeling good that I had a boyfriend who dropped everything on a Friday night to come and see me. I was checking my messages that night, hoping that something would come through while Kyle was on the drive over, proving that he wasn't the one sending the abuse. Now, by this point, I was pretty certain he wasn't, but the confirmation would have been nice. I got the confirmation that night, but not in the way that I could have ever expected. I was reading, I think, when the commotion sounded from outside. This was beginning to become a routine now. Yelling, shouting, and then a crash. I rushed to the window. Kyle was struggling with someone on the lawn. They were both rolling around out there, and neighbors were already beginning to emerge. I saw Dad step onto our lawn holding his shotgun. I ran outside. Dad had his shotgun trained on these two men, Kyle and Uncle Chris. Kyle had his hands held behind his head while Chris was shouting and ranting. "Shut up," Dad screamed at him. I was shocked to see this gun swing in Chris's direction, and I was even more shocked to hear what Kyle was saying. Kyle had pulled up around the corner outside of our cul-de-sac and walked around the block of my house to avoid waking my family. Now, by now it was nearly 1 a.m. As he'd approached around the back, where my room looked out over, he'd seen a figure standing in my window. It was very clear from his motions that the guy was pleasuring himself. Kyle had yelled and then tackled him and started beating on the guy. And that's when he realized it was Uncle Chris. Now, Uncle Chris denied this, and of course he hadn't been touching himself. He'd just been on his patrol, like usual, keeping me safe. Now, this could have been believed, except Dad's eyes traveled down to Chris's crotch. His fly was clearly undone, and his clothing was very disheveled. Now, when Uncle Chris saw where Dad had been looking, his face went as white as a goddamn sheet. It had always been Uncle Chris leading this narrative, and it had been Uncle Chris who had been caught in the backyard by the neighbor that first time and come up with some story about how he'd been chasing a mysterious third party. It had been Uncle Chris who threw the rock at my window, claiming that there was an intruder. It had been Uncle Chris who had repeatedly persuaded us to keep the cops' involvement to a minimum so we could handle it ourselves. Uncle Chris, who was at our house either most mornings or most evenings, who would know what I was wearing to school, who would have time in the day to send various abusive messages. Uncle Chris, who could easily have slipped into the house during the barbecue and left the note on that refrigerator. Uncle Chris, who was able to shove cake into the mailbox because he was the one keeping the house safe, quote-unquote, in the first place. Uncle Chris knew all about my eating disorder, my insecurities, my weaknesses, and fears. Uncle Chris, my dad's flesh and blood brother, who'd been a beloved presence in my life since I was born, stalking me, harassing me, fantasizing about me, and that trauma still exists for me 16 years later. Now, I'll summarize everything briefly, as we did get the cops involved, but the online stalking charges didn't amount to much back then, and it was Kyle's word against Chris that he'd been perving on me through the window. Ultimately, there wasn't much that we could achieve with the law. Why did Chris do all of this? It turned out that he'd always incredibly hated my dad for marrying my mom. Chris was the older brother and had secretly harbored a thing for my mom, and I don't know the extent of it, and I don't want to know, but he came clean about a bunch of small yet spiteful acts that he'd committed against my dad and our family over the years. Accidents that weren't really accidents, damage around the house that happened mysteriously, neighborhood kids keying Dad's car, all sorts of amounts of small yet terrifying incidents, and then apparently when I hit 18, I quote-unquote blossomed into looking too close to Mom, and that made him hate me too, as well as apparently, well, yeah. So he decided to hurt our whole family in one evil go. And after all this came out, we'd never seen Chris again. Dad had passed away 10 years later and Mom just a couple of years ago. My two siblings were doing well as they both lived overseas and haven't heard from Chris. As for me, the event destroyed my trust and my life, and Kyle and I didn't stay together for much longer after that because I simply couldn't bring myself to trust anyone close to me at all. Chris had been like a second father figure to me, and to say that I took all this hard would be an understatement. It was devastating. There's no happy ending. It just makes me sad that Dad never lived to see Chris put in the ground. That's happened now, though, and apparently he listed me as his closest living relative because a few weeks ago I was informed that Chris had died in a motorcycle accident a few states over. Apparently he was strung out on meth and showed signs of long-term addiction. I don't think I'll have any more involvement than being informed, but I'm glad to know that he's gone, and I hope it was painful. I have moved on and I have a partner and family of my own, and I'm just very grateful that my kids can't grow up with a terrifying paternal uncle, because my husband is an only child. So I just wanted to tell you about my last date. His name was Greg and he was perfect. I met him on Grindr and I genuinely saw a future with this guy. And I guess there was a future, just not a future that I could have ever predicted. Now, we chatted on the app for a few days before deciding on our first date. A lunch date picnic in the park. And I booked it during our lunch hour because, well, I was on my lunch hour, and I also knew that there'd be a bunch of other people around. Always important for a first date or a first time meeting a new person. Now, I'm not really new to the dating game. I'm the type of guy who struggles to settle down. Well, not yet anyway, and not that I sleep around or have multiple people on the go at once. I'm just really picky and I get tired of people's idiosyncrasies very quick. Now, I know this makes me kind of flaky and unappealing as a prospective partner, so I try and make up for that in other ways by keeping myself well-groomed and fit, etc. I want people to give me a chance, even if I'm not always best at doing the same in kind. Now, Greg was wonderful. Mid-20s, I'm late 20s. He was very calm, gentle, almost quiet, a very thoughtful guy. Now, our lunch date ran longer because we spent so long talking about literature, art, movies, politics, you name it. Everything we could think to talk about, and we found very mutual interest in each of the topics. Now, you could say that we really clicked. The date had to end because I could only be so late getting back to work, and I was feeling really good about this one, though. And it seemed as if Greg felt the same about me because he messaged me that same evening saying that he'd had an amazing time and would I like to do it again. Well, would I? And so we arranged for another lunch date, and this time on a day that we both had time off of work. Now, I work as a junior lawyer at a firm, and Greg, well, he told me he worked in fashion. Who really knows, though? We met at an Olive Garden and had another lovely time. Over breadsticks, I brought up the fact that I was bisexual. Now, this can be a showstopper for some gay men. There's all sorts of prejudice towards bisexuals from both sides of the fence, so I like to bring it up ASAP, and if it's going to be an issue, then there's plenty of time for both of us to just bail. Now, Greg seemed completely unbothered by this and even asked about previous partners, whether I thought it was easier being bisexual than gay or straight, and he told me he'd always considered that it would be harder for a variety of reasons. He was very sincere and sweet about it. He had a youthful curiosity about life that just really appealed to me. Now, for our third date, we went out for dinner at a small, family-owned restaurant near my apartment. I like to eat late on weekends, and Greg was acquiescent to that, so I booked a table for 9 p.m., that is. Now, we had a delightful time. Neither of us drank, and I offered to order a bottle of wine, but Greg had driven to the restaurant and told me that he wouldn't even have a sip of alcohol if he was driving, and I could respect that. And so the night played out wonderfully. It was just past midnight when we went out to the parking lot, and there, pressed against Greg's car, we shared our first kiss. I genuinely felt sparks, and it was wonderful. Which is why I was a tiny bit puzzled when Greg bid me a good night, got into his car, and drove off. He didn't even offer me a ride home or anything. I've been planning to invite him in, actually. And still, it didn't get to me too much, though. The kiss had clearly been full of passion, and I don't think Greg had lost interest. He was probably trying to play it coy and hadn't quite landed it. And by the time I'd walked a few blocks, I'd convinced myself it was just that. And when he sent me a message a couple of minutes later thanking me for an amazing night and implying that next time it should be an overnighter, my fears were alleviated. At least, my fears about Greg. The route back from that restaurant was about a half-hour's walk through suburbs, but in between the restaurant and my suburb, there was a shortcut through a forest path that would save about 10 minutes of walking. Now, when I say forest, it was more of a public park, so it had sporadic lighting, and although I wouldn't recommend it at night, I felt comfortably safe as a fit late-20s guy who works out and feel like I can handle myself in a fight. Now, that didn't stop me from feeling jumpy when I kept hearing twigs cracking behind me, though. I'd walk a few feet and turn, and absolutely certain that I'd heard rustling in the undergrowth. I'd walk a bit more, and suddenly branches would swish and a stick crunches, spin around again, and nothing. That kind of thing. Was there a shadow lurking past the tree line? I couldn't be sure, and instead I just stuck my head down and kept on walking through those woods. I heard a crack. Oh, there's definitely somebody there, and I called out. "Hey, you got a problem, buddy?" It was a stupid thing to say, and all I got back was silence. Now, I stuck my hands in my pockets and just kept on walking. It was the middle of last summer, but a sudden chill had gone through my spine. There were these light patters of rain beginning to hit my overcoat. Perfect, I thought. I sped up, convincing my inner machismo that it was due to the rain, not the fear of being stalked. Now, thankfully, I exited the forest and began walking the few blocks to the small single-story suburban house that I'd purchased from my parents when they moved to Florida. And I glanced around nervously over my shoulder and saw someone lingering under a streetlight. He wasn't looking in my direction, and he could have been anyone, but he hadn't been there when I walked past. And now it looks like he was standing still. I pretended to check my phone, keeping an eye on this guy, and I couldn't see his face, but he looked pretty built. Or maybe he was just wearing layers, it was hard to tell. My night vision isn't the best, and he was right under the street lamp. Now, the best thing to do, I decided, was just ignore him, but I did reach into my pocket and grip my keys as a sort of makeshift weapon. Now, 3 more times on the walk back, I became absolutely certain that I was being followed. Every time I'd whip around and nobody would be there, except I'd always see leaves fluttering as if they'd just been disturbed, or a bush seemed to be swaying as if someone had brushed past it, but I thought it was the wind. Now, one time again I called out asking if anyone was following me, and the porch light of a nearby house flicked on. I wasn't sure if it was a motion sensor or whether I'd just woken somebody up, so I kept on going. Now, I finally arrived home. My car was sat in the driveway, and I could see that the living room light was on through the huge bay windows that looked into the front yard, and I let myself in with my key. "Honey, I'm home," I yelled. It was sort of a reoccurring joke, but I was also kind of trying to reassure myself. My roommate Meg, not her real name, but she does love Family Guy, was up and, as usual, was burning the midnight oil and working on her dissertation. And that was her excuse anyways, as she was really just wanting the details of my date. She knew that I'd really been digging this Greg guy, and she and her boyfriend Simon were really hoping that I'd find someone to settle down with. She asked how things went, and I'd said I'd tell her all about it. So we made some drinks and took it into the living room. I took the couch and Meg took the single-seater recliner, and we both put our cups on the table. I sort of leaned back satisfied, and then the front window exploded. Yeah, everything seemed to happen almost in slow motion. I briefly caught movement outside in that darkness, and then something hit the window, hard enough to send the glass shattering in an explosion of sparkling shards. No sooner had that happen than something distinctly man-sized bursting through the open, sending further explosions of glass around the room. Now this figure landed on his feet on our living room floor, shook himself like a goddamn dog shaking off water, shards of splintered glass flying everywhere, and me and Meg holding up our arms to protect our faces. This man screamed something indiscernible. Something like that, I don't even know, but I could hear dark, ragged breaths coming from him. Who was this? Some meth head here to rob us, I thought. Someone on bath salts, a neighbor, an Amazon delivery driver. All of these thoughts were bursting through my head in half a second. No. You already know who it is, right? It was Greg. And Greg gestured wildly at us with this tire iron that he just used to smash our front bay window in. I effing knew it, he grunted again. I just stared at him in shock. Meg stared too, and of course she had no idea who he was at all, having only just seen him in 1 or 2 pictures on my phone. And here, he looked frantic and feral. I started to stand, but Greg swung that tire iron dangerously close to me, so I sat back down on the couch. I knew it, he said. I knew you were married. I could see a pale band on your ring finger. You were hiding your wedding ring. This was, of course, complete nonsense. I'm not married and never have been. Whatever kind of paranoia Greg had about dating a married man, he must have projected it so hard onto me that he saw a clue that wasn't even there. So this is Greg. Greg, this is my roommate Meg. And at that exact moment, at that exact perfect moment, the living room door bursts open, and Simon stumbles into the room, bleary-eyed with bedhead and clutching our baseball bat. And this is Meg's boyfriend, Simon, I added. Now Greg just stared between the 3 of us. His expression changed like 10 times in a matter of seconds. Fury, horror, fear, anger, sadness, nausea, fury again, and then finally sort of bemused. Oh, well, sorry. Now he couldn't even blame it on the alcohol. He didn't have a drop to drink that night. Now what happened was, Greg had previously suffered a couple of bad experiences with grinder dates, go figure. Specifically straight or bi-curious men trying out the lifestyle with Greg without a care for his feelings. And he said it happened a lot, but I imagine it was more like once or twice. And I got the impression that Greg fell for people easily, and he fell for them hard. So instead of waiting for me to break his heart, he decided to feign driving home, and then parked away from the restaurant and followed me back on foot with the hopes of allaying his wild paranoia when he saw that I lived alone. On the walk there, he'd managed to convince himself that he'd noticed a pale band of flesh on my ring finger in the restaurant's lighting, and that for some reason, this is why I'd only agreed to dates in the daytime before then, as if that made any kind of sense. Now, I don't think people like Greg ever made much sense, because he was clearly very, very mentally unwell and needed help. And that's why it killed me to call the cops and actually press charges, because I knew that I had to, because at least that might lead to him being forced to get help. Now, he didn't have to go to jail, but there was a fine, and I'm told that he underwent some court-appointed anger management nonsense. I don't think anger was his biggest problem, though. I think he needed help, but hey, I'm not a doctor. I haven't been on any dates since Greg last summer, not through Grindr or Tinder or any other means. And for now, I'm perfectly happy to work on myself platonically. Greg, if you're somehow listening to this, I wish you all the best, and I'm sure you'll make someone a great partner one day. But for you and I, please, let's not